The Earhart case begins beneath a warm Pacific sky, and tonight you sit beside the radio log as the paper lies soft under your hand. There is no rush here, and the work can unfold slowly. You can imagine the room at Howland Island on the morning of the 2nd of July, 1937, with humid air pressing against the walls, coffee cooling in a cup, and men listening for a voice that had crossed half the world. The Coast Guard cutter Itasca waited near that small coral island, its decks bright with salt and sun, while Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were expected to appear from the east in their silver Lockheed Electra. The Earhart case, as we hold it tonight, is not only a story of disappearance. It is a story of people listening carefully, writing down times, comparing bearings, checking fuel estimates, and returning again and again to small details that refuse to settle. You turn the first page, and the ink is plain. A signal received, a position uncertain. A search begun across water so wide that even a clear fact could feel small inside it. The investigation began with sound, before it became a map. You hear it as a thin voice in headphones, faint and worn by distance, with static brushing over each word, like dry sand over paper. Earhart's transmissions reached Itasca unevenly that morning, strong at moments, then oddly without reply, because the plane could hear little or nothing from the cutter. The operators wrote what they could, and you can picture the pencil moving quickly, not dramatically, just carefully, because careful work was all they had. By then, the flight had already become a long act of patience. Earhart and Noonan had left Lae, New Guinea, on the 2nd of July, after days of preparation, weather watching, fuel planning, and the ordinary quiet tension of equipment checks. You sit with the record and notice how much depends on ordinary things. A radio frequency, a clock reading, a sunrise line, a tiny island set in a huge ocean. Nothing in the file feels simple. Nothing asks to be hurried. On Itasca, the crew had been waiting for hours. The ship smelled of oil, sea paint, damp rope, and breakfast in the galley, while the radio room carried its own closed-in scent of warm equipment and human concentration. You can feel the narrowness of that room in the notes, the way sound mattered more than sight, and the way every operator must have leaned toward the signal, as if leaning could bring the plane closer. Earhart's voice was heard saying she was near Howland, but the island did not appear beneath her. She reported that fuel was running low, though how low has always remained part of the long puzzle. You turn that line over gently, because it's one of those sentences that later investigators would revisit for years, measuring it against the Electra's tanks, against the long flight from Lae, and against the simple fact that a pilot might speak plainly while still trying to solve the next minute. The tools available were limited, and that matters. There was no satellite image waiting, no radar track spreading across a screen, no black box resting in deep water with a locator beacon. There were radio bearings, navigation tables, celestial fixes, ship logs, weather reports, and human ears. You learn, as the investigators learned, that the Earhart case was built from fragments that had to be handled like thin glass. Fred Noonan had crossed oceans before, and his work depended on sky, time, and mathematics. In the file, he becomes less a shadow and more a working navigator, one more patient person inside the problem. You can imagine his charts folded and refolded, edges softened by use, with pencil marks placed under poor sleep and steady pressure. The investigation had to consider not only where the Electra had been, but what Noonan could have known at dawn, when celestial navigation briefly offered a line across the empty blue. That line, the famous line of position, would become one of the quiet centers of the search. Earhart's last accepted transmission said they were on a line running north and south, or near it, and that they were running on that line. You sit with those words as investigators did, letting them rest beside Howland Island, beside Baker Island, beside the possible paths of a plane that could still be flying but not seeing land. A line can be exact on paper and still feel almost lonely over open water. For the Itasca crew, the shift from waiting to searching did not arrive with music or drama. It arrived as a slow recognition. The expected plane was not overhead. The voice had faded. The horizon stayed empty. You can feel the heat rising off the deck as eyes scan the sky and sea, while the ship began to move from a fixed meeting point into a widening uncertainty. The first search efforts were immediate and practical. Itasca laid smoke, tried to guide the plane, and later began looking along possible courses. The sea around Howland was bright and deceptive, full of glare, with white caps that could imitate wreckage and shadows that could vanish when approached. You turn the page and notice how the investigators were already dealing with the oldest problem in search work: the difference between something seen, something thought to be seen, and something that remains after the eye has looked twice. Reports moved outward through official channels. The Navy became involved. Ships and aircraft were assigned. The Earhart case widened from a planned arrival at a small island into one of the largest air and sea searches of its time. Still, inside the larger operation, the work remained made of small human acts. A man marking a grid, another checking fuel burn, another copying a message while the room smelled of carbon paper and hot dust. When you sit with the search records, you begin to feel the scale in your body. The Pacific is not just a background. It is a distance, a heat, a horizon that repeats itself. A plane could be missed by miles, and miles could mean everything. Search crews looked down from cockpits into a moving surface, where sunlight flashed hard enough to tire the eyes, and where a floating object might appear only for a breath before slipping behind the shine. The early question was simple to state and difficult to live with. Where could the Electra have gone? Investigators considered whether Earhart had missed Howland to the north or south, whether she had turned along the line of position, whether she had flown until fuel was gone, or whether some other landfall had been reached. You can feel the file-resisting closure, because each possibility had enough shape to be considered and not enough proof to become an answer. There was patience even in urgency. That may seem strange, but you see it in the logs. Searchers had to act quickly, yet the thinking had to stay calm. A wrong assumption could send ships across days of empty water. A careless reading of a message could move the center of the search. So you sit with them, in that narrow place between haste and care, where an investigation begins to become a lifetime's question. The Itasca's radio logs became some of the most studied pages in the Earhart case. You can almost feel the thin sheets under your fingertips, each timestamp carrying more weight than anyone expected when it was first written. Later readers would study signal strength, wording, frequency use, and missed communications, asking whether a phrase meant proximity, confusion, confidence, or simple fatigue. The paper does not answer in a voice of its own. It only waits. There were also the messages that came after the disappearance, the reported post-loss signals that would trouble and fascinate investigators for decades. Some were dismissed, some were logged, some were tested against tide, battery power, radio conditions, and the possibility that the Electra had landed somewhere dry enough to transmit for a time. You approach them gently because this part of the file has always drawn hope toward it, and hope can make a signal sound clearer than it really was. Still, the investigators listened. They had to. In the days after the disappearance, radio stations across the Pacific and beyond reported possible signals from Earhart's plane. Bearings were attempted, notes were taken. Families, officials, operators, and amateurs all became part of a wide listening room, stretched across islands and ships and mainland desks. You can imagine the night air around those receivers, the soft crackle of static, the tired hand reaching for a pencil whenever a voice seemed to rise. But there was one more detail waiting inside the first box of records, and it was quieter than the search itself. The fact that almost everyone was working with uncertainty from the very beginning. You turn that uncertainty slowly, as if it were a small object found in the bottom of a drawer, smooth from being handled by many hands. The Earhart case was not born as a cold case. Not at first. It began as a missing arrival, a flight overdue, a problem that still seemed close enough to solve if the right ship moved in the right direction. Yet even in those first hours, the investigators had no fixed last position, no confirmed sighting, and no final message that said plainly where the Electra was. They had fragments, and the fragments had to be treated with care. That is what it was like to investigate from the beginning. You did not stand before a clean map with one neat circle drawn in red. You sat with a chart that invited several circles, each one plausible enough to keep. One circle sat near Howland, because Earhart's signal seemed strong there. Another stretched along the line she described, where north and south became more than directions, becoming a quiet corridor over the sea. Another rested in the minds of those who wondered about islands farther away, places whose names would return again and again as the decades passed. In the records, Howland Island feels almost impossibly small. You can picture it as a low, pale mark on the ocean, a narrow strip of coral and scrub, with surf breaking around it in a white rim. From the air, it could vanish in glare, especially after a long night of flying and calculation. Investigators had to imagine that view from Earhart's cockpit, not from a desk. You lean over the map with them, and the scale becomes humbling, because a whole world of effort was aimed at a place barely larger than a thought. The searchers did not need mystery in order to feel pressure. The facts themselves were enough. A pilot and navigator were missing. A plane had not arrived. Families were waiting, officials were being asked for answers they did not yet have. You can hear the paper in the offices, the telephone bells, the scrape of chairs, the low voices of men trying to be useful without pretending certainty. Investigation at its best often begins that way, with people admitting what they don't know, then building carefully from the few things they do. You return to the radio messages because they are the nearest thing to the vanished plane. They carry breath, timing, distance, and effort. Earhart had reported that she was on the line of position, and she had mentioned running north and south, a phrase that became one of the most considered lines in the whole Earhart case. You can almost see an investigator decades later tracing that line with a ruler, pausing where it crosses Howland, then extending it farther, down towards islands that were not supposed to matter that morning, but slowly began to matter in the file. The investigators in 1937 also had to account for the way radio worked then. Signals could be strong without being clear. A receiver could be tuned wrongly, damaged, overloaded, or simply unlucky at the exact moment when luck was needed. The Itasca sent voice and Morse code. Earhart mostly transmitted by voice. Direction finding depended on frequency, equipment, altitude, distance, and cooperation between sender and listener. You sit with these details and feel how much of the search was shaped by invisible conditions, by waves moving through air, by metal wires, by batteries, by timing. Nothing about that was abstract to the people in the radio rooms. Their work had texture, headphones pressed against ears, pencil points dulled, sleeves brushed against logbooks. The room might smell of varnish, sweat, and warm insulation, while outside, the sea light burned white through a doorway. You could imagine a man writing down a phrase, then looking at it again, wondering if he had heard the word correctly through the crackle. In that little pause, before the next message, you begin to understand how patient detective work is, sometimes only the discipline of not improving the evidence. That discipline mattered because later readers wanted clarity more than the records could give. A strong signal suggested nearness, but nearness to what, and under what conditions, could still be argued. A missing transmission could mean silence in the cockpit, or a technical problem, or a message simply not received. You turn the page, and the marks remain modest. They do not speak in dramatic language. They say what was logged, what was attempted, what was heard, and sometimes what could not be known. As the first search widened, the Navy and Coast Guard searched by sea and air. The carrier Lexington and other vessels would become part of the effort, bringing aircraft crews, fuel calculations, and long daily sweeps over water. You can feel the shift in scale, from one cutter waiting near Howland to a wider operation spread across a great blue field. Yet every aircraft still held a human pair of eyes, looking down, blinking against glare, trying to separate wave shadow from wreckage, reef edge from possible landing place, nothing from something. When you read about those flights, you can almost feel the vibration through the seat and the heat inside the cabin. Search aircraft moved over reefs, islands, lagoons, and open water, each pass requiring attention that must have become difficult to sustain. The eye grows tired when the world repeats itself. Blue water, white line, coral shelf, green patch, then blue water again. Investigators later had to ask not only where searchers looked, but how well any human being could see at that speed and height, in that light. The official search eventually covered a vast area, but even vast searches leave spaces. That is one of the gentlest and most difficult truths in the Earhart case. A search can be sincere, expensive, organized, and still incomplete, because the ocean does not become small just because human worry has become large. You sit with the charts and imagine grid lines drawn in patient ink. Each line promises order. Each blank between the lines reminds you that order is not the same as certainty. The early search also had to decide how long the plane could have remained airborne. Fuel estimates became central. Earhart's Electra had been modified for long-distance flight, carrying large amounts of fuel, but weather, headwinds, engine settings, altitude and route efficiency all mattered. You can imagine investigators turning performance figures over in quiet offices, running numbers on paper, comparing expected endurance against the time of the last accepted transmission. The smell here is not sea air now, but paper, ink, and tobacco in a room where the afternoon has gone still. Fuel is a practical thing, but in a missing aircraft case it becomes strangely emotional. It measures time left, it measures options, it narrows the sky. For the Earhart case, fuel calculations shaped whether searchers looked close to Howland, farther along the line of position, or toward remote islands that might have been reachable only under certain assumptions. You sit beside the old calculations and resist making them sharper than they are, because every number depends on another number, and every number carries a little weather inside it. Weather itself was another quiet investigator in the case. It did not speak, but it shaped what could be seen and done. Reports from the region gave clues about clouds, winds, visibility, and sea state, and each clue mattered to navigation. A headwind could change arrival time. Cloud could complicate celestial fixes. Haze could hide a small island. You can feel the damp warmth in the cockpit, the long night pressing against the windows, and the navigator working with whatever openings the sky allowed. In a case like this, even the air becomes evidence. Fred Noonan's role asks for particular patience. It is easy, years later, to turn a navigator into either a perfect instrument or a convenient source of error. The file asks for better than that. You sit with him as a working person, trained and experienced, yet bound by the same limits as everyone else aboard that plane. He had charts, clocks, celestial methods and skill, but he was navigating toward an island that was small, low, and alone after a very long flight. The human element is not weakness. It is the setting of the work. Amelia Earhart's role asks for the same respect. She was not merely a symbol in the sky. She was a pilot managing engines, fuel, radio, fatigue, expectation, and the practical business of finding a landing field that did not appear. Investigators had to separate the public figure from the working aviator. You can almost hear the difference between newspaper language and logbook language. One broad and bright, the other clipped and useful. The Earhart case lives most honestly in that second language, where a life becomes real through tasks. Public attention came quickly, and it changed the air around the investigation. Newspapers wanted updates. Officials gave statements. Rumors began to move, as rumors do, through uncertainty and hope. You can imagine a morning paper folded beside a breakfast plate, the ink slightly smudged on someone's thumb, with a headline trying to fit an ocean into a few words. For investigators, every public claim had to be weighed. A reported sighting, a strange signal, a possible clue. Each one needed patience before it could be given meaning. That patience is not always visible from the outside. From far away, a cold case can look like a row of theories. Inside the work, it is more often a row of folders. One folder holds radio logs, another holds weather summaries, another holds search tracks, another holds letters from people who believed they heard something, saw something, remembered something. You turn each folder with the slow respect it deserves, because even an error may have been offered in good faith, and good faith still needs testing. The post-loss radio signals became one of those folders that never quite stayed closed. Some reports described a woman's voice, some were weak, some seemed unlikely, others were taken seriously enough to influence search thinking for a time. You sit with those messages at night, perhaps in an archive room where the fluorescent light hums softly, and you understand why they were difficult. If the Electra had landed on a reef, its radio might have worked when the water was low enough and the battery still had power. That possibility, however slender, had a pull. Investigators later studied those signals against tide patterns, especially in connection with Gardner Island, now known as Nikumaroro. The idea was not simply romantic. It asked whether an aircraft on a reef flat could transmit for a limited period before being damaged or washed away. You place the old signal reports beside tide tables and feel the case become quiet and technical again. Times are compared, frequencies are noted, bearings are tested. Hope is allowed into the room, but only if it sits beside mathematics and does not disturb the papers. Nikumaroro would become one of the long-running names in the Earhart case, though it was Gardner Island in many older records. It lies southeast of Howland, along a line that made some investigators and later researchers pause. In 1937, aircraft from the battleship Colorado searched the island and reported signs of recent habitation, though no clear evidence of Earhart or Noonan was found. You imagine the reef from above, pale under clear water, with lagoon colors shifting from green to blue, and the search aircraft passing over in a brief moment. That briefness matters. An aerial search can see many things and miss many things. Vegetation can hide objects, sun angle can confuse edges. Human beings looking for survivors may not interpret every sign the same way later researchers would. You sit with the Colorado search report gently, neither forcing it to prove too much, nor brushing it aside. It belongs to the case because it shows how investigation often moves, not from certainty to certainty, but from one carefully described observation to another, each one resting in the file like a shell on a desk. Other islands were examined as well. The Phoenix Islands, the Gilbert Islands, and wide areas around the intended route all entered the thinking at different times. Searchers had to decide where a plane might have gone after missing Howland, whether a turn southeast was reasonable, whether a turn northwest was possible, and whether any landfall could have been reached. You look across those island names and hear them almost like quiet bells, each one marking distance, water, weather, and the difficulty of turning a disappearance into a map. There was also the sea itself, the simplest and broadest theory that the Electra ran out of fuel near Howland and came down in the Pacific. This is often called the crash and sink explanation, but we hold it softly here, without harshness. It asks us to stay near the last accepted messages and the intended destination. It respects the strength of the radio signal and the failure to find land. You sit with that possibility as investigators have for decades, feeling the sober weight of water, depth, current, and absence. Absence is evidence of a kind, though never an easy kind. No confirmed wreckage was recovered. No indisputable aircraft part was found in the official search area. No final position was fixed. Each absence leaves room, and room invites interpretation. You can imagine a detective years later opening a cabinet and finding not one answer, but several spaces where an answer might have been. The Earhart case did not become enduring because nothing was known. It became enduring because enough was known to keep returning, and not enough was known to rest. The official search ended after many days, as official searches eventually must. Ships cannot remain forever. Aircraft need fuel and maintenance. Crews have limits. Governments make decisions. But a case does not end inside the hearts of those who keep questions. You can feel the change when the active search becomes a file, when urgency cools into correspondence, reports, memoirs, interviews, and private theories. The paper changes temperature. It is no longer warm from immediate handling. It becomes archival, and yet it still seems to breathe. For the families, the waiting took on another shape. Investigation is not only done by people with badges, uniforms, or official titles. It is also done by those who reread letters, preserve photographs, and remember the sound of a voice. Earhart's husband, George Putnam, remained part of the public aftermath, navigating grief, hope, publicity, and uncertainty. You do not need to enter those feelings loudly. It is enough to notice them as a quiet wait beside the official documents, because every cold case has a private room behind the records. As years passed, the Earhart case moved from immediate mystery into historical investigation. That transition changes the tools. Witnesses age, memories soften, documents are misplaced, found, copied, and interpreted. Islands change, reefs shift, aircraft technology advances. Sonar, underwater imaging, forensic anthropology, and archival research later joined a case that had begun with radio logs and search planes. You sit in this longer timeline and feel how a mystery can outlive its first investigators, then invite a second generation to take up the same thread. In that later work, the atmosphere is different. You are no longer on the deck of Itasca, with salt spray and engine noise nearby. You may be in a library, with climate-controlled air and a cart of boxes rolling softly between shelves. The folders smell faintly of old paper and dust. A pencil is allowed, but not a pen. You lift a photograph by its edges, because even the texture of the paper has become part of the evidence. This, too, is what it was like to investigate the Earhart case, the quiet handling of time. Time can clarify and time can blur. It can bring better tools, but it can also take away living witnesses. It can calm public noise, but it can let stories harden into legend. Investigators had to separate what was documented from what was repeated, and what was repeated from what was merely loved by the imagination. You can feel the patience required for that work. It is not glamorous. It is a steady sorting, a willingness to say this was recorded, this was claimed, this was inferred, and this remains uncertain. One of the later questions concerned whether bones found on Gardner Island in 1940 might have been connected to the missing flight. The remains were examined at the time, and the original bones were later lost, leaving measurements and notes as the surviving evidence. You approach this part with quiet care, without turning it into spectacle. The human dignity remains central. Investigators and researchers could only work from records, measurements, context, and the history of an island that had already held many kinds of human passage and hardship. The Gardner Island bones became another example of the case's long patience. A discovery made years after the disappearance, evaluated with the methods then available, later reconsidered by others with different questions and tools. You can imagine the old measurements on a page, plain and limited, carrying more attention than their writer might ever have expected. Some later analyses argued one way. Others disagreed. The absence of the actual bones meant the question could not be settled cleanly. The file, once again, remained open. Objects reportedly found on Nikumaroro also drew attention over the years. Pieces of glass, fragments of metal, a woman's compact, a shoe part, campfire remains, and other artifacts were studied by researchers looking for patterns. Each object asked to be placed in context. Was it from colonists, Coast Guard personnel, earlier visitors, shipwreck survivors, or perhaps someone connected to the Electra? You sit at the table with these items in mind, feeling the cool surface beneath your wrists, and you understand how easily an object can become louder than its proof. Good investigation keeps objects at their proper volume. A fragment of aluminum may look meaningful, but metal travels through many histories. A bottle may suggest presence, but islands collect human traces over decades. A shoe part may fit a time period, but not necessarily a person. You turn the evidence gently, never dismissing it, never overholding it. The Earhart case teaches that patience is not only waiting for answers, sometimes patience is refusing to make an answer out of a thing that can only be a clue. The Electra itself remains central, though absent. It was a Lockheed Model 10E special, polished and practical, a machine built for distance, and modified for Earhart's world flight attempt. You can picture its smooth metal skin in old photographs, the cockpit windows, the twin engines, the long wings that carried fuel and hope across oceans. Investigators studied what the plane could do, how it might behave on landing, what parts might survive, and where wreckage might settle if it entered deep water. The missing aircraft is a shape inside every theory. Underwater searches later brought a different kind of quiet. Sonar screens, survey lines, remotely operated vehicles, and deep ocean equipment replaced the naked eye scanning a bright surface. The sensory world changed from sunlight and glare to dark water, electronic pulses, cold depths, and images forming slowly on monitors. You sit beside that later search team in imagination, hearing the low hum of equipment, watching a screen where a ridge or shadow might become important. The work is patient in a new way, because the ocean floor offers no easy welcome. Searching underwater near Howland is not a simple matter of looking beneath the last known place. The depths fall away sharply. The terrain can be difficult. A small aircraft, after many decades, may not present itself as a recognizable shape. Currents, corrosion, and impact all complicate the picture. You learn to respect the limits of technology, even modern technology. A sonar image can suggest, a camera can confirm or disappoint, and between suggestion and confirmation, there is often a long, quiet wait while data is reviewed again. The Nikamaroro searches asked different questions. Instead of deep ocean near Howland, researchers examined reef flats, island campsites, lagoon edges, and surrounding waters. They studied colonial records, photographs, oral histories, and artifacts. You can feel the heat there differently than at Howland, a more enclosed heat, with vegetation, birds, coral rubble, and the hush of a lagoon in afternoon light. The investigators moved through terrain rather than only over charts, looking for traces that weather, settlement, and time had not already folded back into the island. Every island search carries its own humility. Coral cuts skin, sun bleaches surfaces, storms move heavy things, roots split ground. Human occupation leaves layers that can confuse a neat theory. You walk with the investigators in a careful line, eyes lowered, not as treasure hunters, but as readers of a difficult page. A scrap can matter. A scrap can mislead. The difference may depend on measurements, provenance, comparison collections, and a willingness to leave the question unresolved when the evidence asks for restraint. Photographs also became part of the long investigation. Old images were studied for possible aircraft parts, reef shapes, shadows, and historical context. A photograph carries an odd kind of intimacy. You hold a moment that cannot answer you. You can enlarge it, contrast it, scan it, compare it to maps, and still it remains light captured on a particular day. In the Earhart case, a photograph might open a line of inquiry, but it cannot bear more weight than its grain, angle, and history allow. You learn to look softly. Looking softly does not mean looking vaguely. It means looking without forcing. You notice the edge of a reef, the curve of a shoreline, the position of wreckage from other known events, the way shadows fall when the sun is high. You compare dates. You ask who took the photograph and why. You ask what changed between one image and another. This is patient detective work in its most delicate form, where the eye wants a pattern and the mind must ask whether the pattern is truly there. Witness accounts brought another layer. In the years after the disappearance, stories surfaced from islands, ships, and later recollections, some suggesting signs of an aircraft, castaways, or foreign capture. The Japanese capture theory, in particular, became part of public imagination, tied to the Marshall Islands and wartime fears. Investigators had to handle these accounts carefully, because memory is human, and history around the Pacific was complex. You sit with the testimonies as you would sit with old letters, listening for sincerity while still asking what can be corroborated by records. This is where compassion and rigor need each other. A witness may be honest and still mistaken. A memory may preserve a feeling more clearly than a date. A story may grow as it is retold, not because someone means harm, but because human beings make meaning from fragments. You, as the quiet detective tonight, do not mock the accounts. You place them beside ship movements, military records, island histories, and timelines, then see what remains after the comparison has done its slow work. The Japanese capture theory has never been accepted as the official answer, and many researchers have challenged it with records and practical objections. Yet its persistence tells us something about the Earhart case. When a disappearance leaves no settled ending, people reach for narratives that contain intention, witnesses, and hidden records, because those feel more human than deep water and silence. The investigator's task is not to scold that impulse. It is to return to the file, to the dates, to the distances, and to the evidence that can be tested. Testing is the quieter word beneath the whole case. Test the radio claim. Test the fuel estimate. Test the island hypothesis. Test the artifact. Test the memory. You can hear the rhythm of it like pages turning under a lamp, each test narrowing or failing to narrow the room. In a solved case, testing may lead to a door. In the Earhart case, testing often led to another corridor, lit only partway, with more shelves along the wall and more boxes waiting in shadow. The aircraft's radio equipment remained one such corridor. Earhart's transmissions, antenna issues, frequency choices, and the loss of the receiving antenna after takeoff from Leh have all been discussed by researchers. If the electric could transmit but not receive well, then the tragedy of communication becomes painfully practical. The plane might have been calling, while guidance from Itasca failed to reach it. You sit with that possibility quietly, not to heighten drama, but to feel the human frustration of machines almost connecting, yet not quite enough. In that sense, the Earhart case is a study in near contact. The cutter was near the intended destination. The plane seemed near enough to be heard strongly. The island was there, waiting in the morning light. The searchers were ready. And yet, the essential connection did not happen. You can place your hand on the file and feel how much of life sometimes turns on small mismatches. A frequency, a bearing, a cloud bank, a few miles of drift, a delayed reply. Investigation becomes a way of honoring those margins. The people working the case in its early hours did not have the luxury of hindsight. We do, and that means we must be careful with it. It is easy to sit decades later and notice what might have been done differently. But the people on the scene were tired, limited by equipment, and working under uncertainty. You read their logs without condescension. They were not characters in a mystery. They were workers in real time, trying to guide two missing people home with the tools at hand. That attitude changes the way you read mistakes. A missed opportunity becomes not a dramatic failure, but a human event inside a difficult system. A confusing order becomes part of the fog of work. A disputed signal becomes an artifact of technology and stress. The Earhart case invites judgment from a distance, yet patient investigation asks you to replace quick judgment with context. What did they know then? What could they know then? What did the instruments allow? What did the morning conceal from everyone? The press coverage created another kind of record, one that investigators and historians must use carefully. Newspapers captured public reaction, official statements, rumors, and changing emphasis, but they also compressed uncertainty into readable form. A headline wants shape. A case file often has none. You can imagine clipping after clipping stored in a folder, the paper browned at the edges, each article preserving a mood as much as a fact. The investigator reads them but slowly, letting official logs and primary records hold the center. Earhart's fame made the investigation larger than most disappearances. Her flights had carried symbolic meaning, especially for women in aviation, and for a public learning to imagine the world as crossable by air. That meant the search carried more than operational concern. It carried admiration, pride, anxiety, and the public's need to understand what had happened to someone they felt they knew. You sit with that too, because a famous person can become too bright in memory, and the investigator's work is to find the human being inside the glare. Fred Noonan, less famous to the public, also deserves that return to human scale. He was not merely the man beside Earhart, he was a professional navigator whose experience mattered deeply. His family, his career, his fatigue, and his choices all belong to the story. When you read the file patiently, you make room for him. You imagine the navigator's table, the charts, the chronometer, the small calculations made while engines droned through the night. The Earhart case is often named for one person, but the flight carried two. As the years moved on, official interest faded, and private research grew. Books were written, expeditions were planned, old records were requested, copied, disputed, and reinterpreted. Some researchers favored deep water near Howland, others favored Nikumaroro, others pursued Marshall Islands accounts. Each school built its own shelves of evidence. You sit in the middle of that quiet library and understand that long investigations can become communities of attention, with disagreement, pride, patience, and sometimes frustration settling over the work like dust. Disagreement is not always a flaw. In a cold case, it can keep questions alive. But disagreement needs discipline if it is to help. The best investigators ask what evidence would change their mind. They name uncertainty clearly. They separate possibility from probability. You can feel the calm strength in that kind of thinking. It does not need to speak loudly. It simply returns again and again to the same table, the same documents, the same artifacts, asking whether the next reading is better than the last one. The Earhart case has also been shaped by improvements in forensic thought. Earlier, investigators did not have the same methods for evaluating skeletal measurements, DNA, trace materials, or remote sensing data. Later researchers could revisit old notes with new frameworks, though the loss of original materials often limited what could be done. That is one of the case's quiet sorrows. Sometimes the thing most needed now was not preserved then, because no one could know what future tools would ask of the past. You can feel that in the missing bones from Gardner Island. A modern lab might have been able to test them, compare DNA, examine isotopes, or answer questions that paper measurements cannot answer alone. But the bones are gone, and the file must live with that absence. Patient detective work includes accepting the evidence that history failed to keep. It includes reading the surviving notes with care, but not pretending the notes are the same as the material itself. The empty place on the shelf becomes part of the case. Archival losses appear in many old mysteries. A misplaced file, a discarded envelope, a photograph without a date, a witness who was never interviewed in time. You learn not to treat these losses as plot devices, but as ordinary consequences of years passing through institutions. Offices move, wars happen, staff changes, cabinets are cleared, labels fade. In the Earhart case, as in so many cold cases, the investigator is partly a detective and partly an archivist, listening for what the records say and for where they fall silent. Silence can be difficult to interpret. If no wreckage was found, does that mean it was not there, or that searchers missed it, or that the ocean took it, or that the wrong place was searched? If no document confirms a witness account, does that mean the account is false, or only that documentation failed? You sit with these questions until they lose their sharp edges. The work is not to make silence speak too quickly. The work is to understand how many kinds of silence there are. In a quiet room, that kind of work has its own rhythm. You read for an hour, then look away. You compare a chart, then return to the log. Rain may tap against a window somewhere far from the Pacific, and the case briefly feels like two climates at once, warm island air inside cold archival glass. The paper is dry. The question is old. Your hand rests near the page, and for a moment investigation becomes almost meditative, a way of staying with uncertainty without trying to escape it. The Itasca logs bring you back to the morning itself, whenever the theories drift too far. They are the anchor. Earhart's voice, the reported signal strength, the failure to establish two-way communication, the line of position, the silence after the last accepted message. You can turn many later pages, but eventually the file asks you to return there. Near Howland, early morning, a cutter waiting, a plane not seen, the radio room warm and close, the pencil moving, the horizon holding its pale, unreadable line. That repeated return is part of what makes the Earhart case feel so enduring. It does not open outward forever without center. It has a center, but the center does not resolve. Investigators can hold several possibilities, yet they must keep returning to the evidence closest to the disappearance. You feel that discipline as a kind of quiet gravity. It draws every artifact, every island theory, every radio claim, and every underwater search back toward those final communications and the small island that Earhart could not find. The line of position deserves another slow look. In celestial navigation, a line of position is not a pinpoint. It is a line on which the observer may be located. If Noonan derived such a line from the rising sun, then Earhart's statement may have reflected an attempt to use that line to find Howland by running along it. You can imagine the chart with that line drawn across emptiness, a simple mark carrying enormous consequence. It is one of those details where technical practice and human hope meet in the same stroke. Running north and south along that line would make sense if the plane believed it was close to Howland, but uncertain on which side of the island it lay. Yet if the original estimate was offset, the search along the line might never cross the island. A small error carried forward can become a wide absence. You sit with that idea, and it feels less like mystery than arithmetic under fatigue. The old file teaches that not every unknown needs drama. Some unknowns grow from ordinary limits. 1 degree, 1 hour, 1 wind. Wind over the Pacific that night, and morning has been studied repeatedly. Headwinds stronger than expected could have delayed arrival and increased fuel use. Drift could alter the track. Clouds could limit sightings and celestial fixes. Weather is often treated as background, but in aviation investigation it sits near the front of the table. You can hear it in the engine note, feel it in the slight correction of a course, see it in clouds that open and close over stars. Weather is evidence you cannot put in a box, but it leaves marks. The flight from Leh to Howland was one of the most challenging legs of the world flight attempt. It demanded precision across roughly 2,500 miles of ocean, aiming at a tiny island prepared as a refueling stop. You do not need to make that dramatic. The plain fact is enough. Long distance, small target, limited communication. A tired crew, a waiting ship. When you set these pieces together on the table, the investigation feels less like a riddle designed to be solved and more like a difficult human endeavor that met the edge of its tools. That edge is important. The 1930s were an age of bold aviation, but boldness did not remove uncertainty. Aircraft could cross oceans, yet navigation and communication still required skill, luck, and cooperation from weather and machines. Earhart's flight belonged to that transitional world, where the globe seemed newly reachable and still deeply resistant. Investigators, then and later, had to hold both truths. The achievement was real, the vulnerability was real. The case rests in the space between them, where progress had arrived, but not with perfect certainty. You can sense that transitional world in the photographs. Men in shirt sleeves beside polished aircraft, maps spread across tables, radio masts against pale skies, island runways cut into coral and heat. The materials seem solid, yet the systems were fragile. A wire breaks, a frequency fails, a bearing cannot be taken. A navigator waits for a star through cloud. You look at those images and feel the old future they belong to, a world confident enough to try, but not yet equipped to guarantee. The investigation inherited that fragility. It could not replay the flight. It could not ask the cockpit what happened after the last message. It could only gather traces. That is the central feeling of the Earhart case as a detective matter. Everything important has already moved beyond reach, and you are left with the wake. Radio waves fading, fuel estimates narrowing, search planes crossing water, reports arriving late. The investigator's task is to reconstruct motion from the marks motion left behind, and to do that without pretending the wake is the ship. Sometimes the smallest administrative details become unexpectedly moving. A time zone correction, a copied message, a coordinate written in a slightly different format, a ship name spelled carefully. These are not decorative details. They are the mechanisms by which the case remains readable. You can imagine a clerk typing clean copies, keys striking paper with a steady clack, not knowing that future researchers would study those pages as if they were artifacts from a sealed room. Bureaucracy in a cold case can become a form of memory. Memory, however, needs checking. Copies introduce errors, summaries omit nuance. Later narratives polish rough edges. In the Earhart case, researchers have had to return to primary documents whenever possible, not because later writers lacked sincerity, but because distance changes things. You sit with that habit tonight. Return to the log, return to the map, return to the date, return to the exact wording. It is a quiet discipline, and it keeps the work close to the people who first heard, saw, wrote, and searched. The human need for a final answer has never left the case. It moves through every theory, even the most technical one. People want to know whether Earhart and Noonan ended in the sea, reached a reef, survived for a time, or were carried into some other history. The question is not only factual, it is emotional. A disappearance leaves the mind walking. Investigation offers it a path, even when the path does not reach a door. You too feel that pull, and then you return to the evidence with gentleness. Gentleness is not softness of mind. It is a way of handling difficult material without bending it. You can be firm about what is known and still compassionate about why people wonder. You can reject an unsupported claim without mocking the person who hoped it was true. You can say a theory remains unproven and still recognize the labor behind it. The Earhart case has needed that kind of care for a long time, because it sits at the meeting point of history, grief, fame, and imagination. The official documentation from the search gives one kind of patience. Later expeditions give another. An expedition requires months or years of planning, fundraising, permits, equipment, travel, and field work. all for the possibility of finding nothing conclusive. You can feel that patience in the packing lists and survey plans, in waterproof notebooks, sample bags, measuring tapes, cameras, and spare batteries. The romance of discovery fades quickly in heat and fatigue. What remains is method. Mark the location, record the context, photograph the item, preserve the chain of care. On Nikumaroro, that method must meet a demanding landscape. The reef can be sharp beneath the feet. The lagoon may look calm while the sun presses hard overhead. Vegetation tangles over old ground. Coconut crabs and birds alter what lies on the surface. Storms can move material beyond recognition. You walk slowly in imagination, hearing loose coral shift under boots and feeling the dryness in the mouth that comes from heat. The island does not present evidence like a table. It hides, scatters, absorbs, and changes. The deep ocean near Howland is demanding in a different way. It does not cut the hands with coral or cover a trail with leaves. It hides by depth, darkness, and scale. Survey equipment moves in lines, patient and expensive, over terrain few eyes have seen directly. A possible target on sonar may require another pass, then another review, then perhaps a camera descent into black water. You sit beside the monitor, and the quiet there is almost total, broken only by equipment hum and the slow appearance of shapes from below. Both landscapes teach humility. The island says evidence can be underfoot and still missed. The ocean says evidence can be nearby and still unreachable. The archive says evidence can be written and still misunderstood. The witness says evidence can be remembered and still changed by time. You keep these lessons together, not as a dramatic list, but as a set of working cautions. The Earhart case asks its investigators to be patient across many environments, each one with its own way of withholding answers. As you move deeper into the file, you notice how often a clue depends on context. A shoe fragment means little without size, style, date, location, and comparison. A piece of metal needs alloy, rivet pattern, manufacturing history, and a known chain of discovery. A radio signal needs frequency, time, propagation conditions, receiver reliability, and independent confirmation. This is the slow craft of investigation. It turns a found thing into a considered thing, and sometimes, after all that work, it turns the considered thing back into an unknown. There is dignity in that, though it can feel unsatisfying. To say unknown is not to fail. It is to leave the record honest for the next person who opens it. Many old cases are damaged by confident guesses written too early. The Earhart case has survived, partly because enough people kept returning to the original uncertainties. You turn the page and imagine writing a small note in the margin. Not an answer, only a reminder. Do not let desire outrun evidence. It is the kind of note that belongs beside a lamp. The international setting also complicates the investigation. The Pacific was not an empty stage. It was full of islands with their own histories, colonial administrations, indigenous communities, shipping routes, military concerns, and later wartime transformations. Any theory that places Earhart and Noonan beyond Howland must enter those histories carefully. You cannot treat an island as merely a clue. You have to ask who lived there, who worked there, who passed through, what records were kept, and how power shaped what was noticed or ignored. That is especially true with local accounts. Pacific Islanders, colonial officers, radio operators, sailors, and later military personnel all appear in different corners of the broader discussion. Some records were official, some were oral, some were filtered through outsiders who did not always listen well. A patient investigator has to be humble here too. You listen for voices that were preserved imperfectly. You ask what may have been lost in translation, in status, in distance, or in the simple fact that not everyone's observations were treated as equally important. The Earhart case, then, is not only an aviation puzzle, it is an archival puzzle shaped by who wrote things down and who was believed. This does not mean every late account becomes proof. It means every account deserves careful placement in its human setting. You sit with that thought as the room grows quieter. Outside the imagined archive, perhaps rain has stopped. Inside, the pages remain, and each page carries not only facts, but the conditions under which those facts were allowed to survive. Survival of records can be accidental. A box stored in the right room, a report copied before it was lost, a photograph preserved by someone who liked old aviation, a letter folded into a family envelope. Decades later, a researcher opens it and feels the small shock of contact with the past. You can imagine that moment without making it loud. The paper is thin. The handwriting may be uneven. The discovery may change nothing, or it may adjust one small part of the map. Either way, the work continues quietly. In cold case work, small adjustments matter. A corrected time may shift a fuel estimate. A clarified phrase may weaken a theory. A newly found map may show what searchers actually intended. The public often waits for a single decisive discovery, but investigators live among increments. You move one pin, you erase one assumption, you label one report uncertain. Over years, these small acts can make the file cleaner, even if they do not make the ending complete. That is a kind of progress, and it has its own peace. The Earhart case has seen many such increments. Better access to government archives, reanalysis of radio logs, renewed study of the Itasca's role, debate over the Colorado search, artifact examination, ocean surveys, historical work on Nikimarora's settlement. Each effort adds or removes weight from certain possibilities. You sit with them as layers, not as competing voices shouting across a room. The calm investigator lets each layer settle, then asks whether the pattern beneath has become clearer or only more detailed. There is also the question of personality and how much it should matter. Earhart was determined, practical, famous, and accustomed to risk, but personality cannot replace evidence. Noonan was skilled, but skill cannot erase the limits of navigation. The Itasca crew was prepared, but preparation cannot guarantee communication. You learn to hold people whole without turning traits into solutions. A brave pilot can become lost. A good navigator can face poor conditions. A ready ship can fail to connect. The case remains human because everyone in it was human. That is why the investigation feels so patient rather than purely technical. It asks you to imagine people doing their best inside conditions that did not yield. Earhart in the cockpit, speaking into the radio, Noonan with his charts, operators straining to hear, search pilots scanning water, families waiting for a call, later researchers bending over boxes. You can move among them gently, and the case becomes less a single mystery than a long chain of attention, each person passing the unanswered question to the next. And still, there was one more part of the file that kept drawing investigators back, the way the last known morning balanced so delicately between nearness and loss. That balance is what gives the Earhart case its quiet pull, because the final morning does not feel distant at first glance. Howland was not an abstract destination. It was prepared, watched, and waiting. The Itasca was there with radio equipment, smoke, and people ready to assist. Earhart's voice was present in the air, not as a memory, but as a living signal moving through static. You sit with that closeness, and the case seems to gather around one almost reachable point of contact. Nearness can be harder to bear than distance. If the Electra had vanished without a word halfway across the Pacific, the mind might settle differently around the loss. But the logs suggest approach, effort, and communication that nearly worked. You imagine the cutter's radio room again, the operator leaning toward the headphones, the pencil hovering above paper, while outside the island waited low and pale under morning light. To investigate that moment is to study not only where a plane went, but how two groups of people almost found one another. The last accepted transmission has been read many ways, and you handle it slowly. Earhart said they were on the line, that they would run north and south, and then the voice faded from the firm record. Those words entered the archive with the plainness of a working message, but they later became a doorway for theories, maps, and arguments. You can see why. A line can extend in two directions. It can pass near safety. It can pass toward unknown water. It can also pass through decades of attention. Investigators had to ask what Earhart and Noonan believed at that moment. Did they think Howland was very near, just hidden by glare or cloud? Did they believe they had reached the correct longitude, but were uncertain in latitude? Were they trying to search along the line until the island appeared? You sit beside the chart and let these questions remain questions. In calm detective work, the act of naming a possibility is not the same as choosing it, and that restraint keeps the file honest. The cockpit itself, though gone from us, becomes an imagined workspace built from known habits and equipment. There would have been engine sound, vibration, the smell of fuel and warm metal, and a long fatigue settling into shoulders after many hours in the air. The windows would frame water and sky, sometimes cloud, sometimes a hard, shining emptiness. You imagine Earhart managing the aircraft and the radio while Noonan worked with the results of celestial navigation, dead reckoning, and the narrowing pressure of time. Nothing here needs drama. The work itself is enough. The investigators on ships and in offices had to build their thinking from those practical conditions. They asked what could be seen from altitude, how far the horizon would reach, what the weather allowed, how much fuel remained, and how radio limitations shaped the final hour. You can feel the careful weight of each question. None stands alone. Visibility touches navigation. Navigation touches fuel. Fuel touches search area. Search area touches the lives of crews who must fly across a sea that offers little feedback and less mercy. Yet the tone of the file is often surprisingly plain. Orders, reports, times, coordinates, attempts. It is not written to make anyone feel awe. That is partly why it still feels powerful when you read it slowly. The people involved were trying to solve a problem, not create a legend. You place your finger on a line of typed text and feel the texture of the paper, the slightly raised ink, the ordinary material that now holds a question people have carried for so many years. When the search moved outward from Howland, it did so under the discipline of probability. The most likely areas had to come first, because fuel, daylight, and available ships were limited. Search planners could not chase every possibility at once. You watch them make choices, not with perfect certainty, but with the best reasoning available at the time. That is an important part of what it was like to investigate the Earhart case. The work was never simply finding, it was always choosing where to look next. Those choices created later debates. If the plane had flown southeast, did the official search spend enough time there? If it had gone down near Howland, did the early search miss the precise place? If post-loss signals were genuine, were bearings followed strongly enough? You can ask these questions without accusation. A cold case invites later minds to revisit earlier choices. But patient reflection asks us to remember the weather of the moment, the partial information, and the human limits under which each choice was made. In the archive, you can almost hear the sound of a large map being unfolded. The paper resists at the creases, then relaxes under the palms. Howland appears as a speck. Baker sits nearby. Farther away, the Phoenix Islands stretch into the discussion, and Gardner Island waits with its reef and lagoon. Each place name changes the temperature of the room. You are no longer reading a single line of flight. You are reading a field of possibilities, each one asking for patience, distance, and scale. Scale is one of the hardest things for the human mind to hold. A chart fits on a table. The Pacific does not. On paper, the line from Leh to Howland is a manageable mark, dark and clean. In the body, it is hours of engine noise, fuel burn, changing sky, and instruments watched under fatigue. You learn, as investigators did, that a map, it helps the mind see. It also makes vastness appear smaller than it ever felt to those who crossed it. That is why sensory detail matters even in technical investigation. Without it, the case becomes too neat. You need the glare on water, the salt on a deck rail, the soft crumble of old newsprint, the chilled air of a records room, and the faint chemical scent of copied documents. These things remind you that evidence was made by people in places. The Earhart case is not only coordinates and theories. It is also hands, eyes, heat, paper, metal, and waiting held across time. The waiting after the official search ended was a different kind of work. No ship remained endlessly circling. No aircraft flew forever, yet questions continued in letters, reports, private notes, and memories. You can imagine an office after the loud part has passed, with chairs pushed in, files tied with string, and the sense that the room still contains unfinished business. The investigators may have moved to other duties, but certain cases do not leave entirely. They become a drawer that never quite closes flush. For Earhart's contemporaries, the loss belonged to the present. For later investigators, it became history. That shift changes the emotional distance, but not the responsibility. A historian cannot ask Earhart a question. A forensic researcher cannot examine every original item. A search team cannot return the Pacific to its 1937 state. You sit with the humility of that. The later investigator works in afterimage, trying to recover not only facts, but the conditions under which those facts first came into being and then scattered. The scattered nature of the evidence explains why the Earhart case has supported so many theories. Some are careful, some are speculative, some grew from misunderstood photographs or hopeful readings of memories. The patient investigator does not need to fight every idea with sharp language. You simply place each theory beside the documented record and ask the same calm questions. What does it explain? What does it require? What would we expect to find if it were true? What has actually been found? That last question matters most. A theory may feel complete, but evidence must carry it. In the crash near Howland explanation, the strongest anchor is proximity to the last transmissions and the intended destination. In the Nikumaroro hypothesis, the anchors include the line of position, possible post-loss signals, island searches, and some artifact claims. In other theories, the anchors may be witness accounts or later interpretations of records. You do not need to decide quickly. You sit at the table and let each anchor show its own weight. Weight is not the same as certainty. That distinction keeps the investigation calm. Evidence can lean. It can suggest. It can invite a search. But not every leaning becomes proof. You may spend an evening with one theory and feel its shape grow persuasive, then return the next day to a primary document that softens it again. This is the slow tide of the Earhart case. It moves forward and back, leaving small things on the sand, then asking you to examine them without haste. Some searchers have looked for aircraft debris on the reef edge near Nikumaroro, considering whether the Electra could have landed on the reef flat at low tide and later been broken up or swept into deeper water. You imagine the reef at dawn, its surface wet and bright, with tide pools holding the sky in shallow fragments. Then you imagine time working on metal, wave by wave, storm by storm. If such a thing happened, evidence might be scattered, hidden, or carried away. The island would keep no easy account. Other searchers have focused near Howland, where deep water could have swallowed the aircraft quickly. That possibility has a different stillness. No camp. No post-loss survival. No island traces. Only a final descent somewhere in a wide search area, followed by sinking darkness and decades of silence. You hold that possibility with quiet respect. It may be the simplest explanation, but simple does not mean easy to prove. Deep water can make even a straightforward event almost unreachable to later eyes. The official position for many years has leaned toward the plane being lost near Howland. Yet the persistence of alternative inquiries shows how unresolved evidence keeps moving. You can feel the difference between administrative closure and emotional closure. A file may be marked in one way. A public question may continue in another. Investigators understand that distinction. They know that a probable answer may guide resources, while a proven answer requires something more solid, something that can be lifted, photographed, tested, and placed in the record with confidence. That kind of solid finding has remained elusive. The absence of a confirmed piece of the Electra is one reason the case continues to breathe. If a serial numbered aircraft part were found, the room would change. If remains were identified, the room would change. If a final message had fixed the position, the room would change. But the room has not changed in that way. Instead, the same lamps remain lit over the same tables, and the investigators keep reading under a gentle uncertainty. You notice how often the case turns on ordinary verbs. Heard, sent, searched, reported, calculated, found, lost, rechecked. These are not glamorous words, but they are the words of real investigation. They form a cadence almost like breathing. You hear them in the records, one after another, not rushing toward a dramatic point, but accumulating into a long human effort. The Earhart case teaches that patient detective work is made less from sudden revelation than from steady verbs repeated across years. The radio direction finding problem is one of those steady areas. Itasca hoped to take bearings on Earhart's signals, but equipment and frequency mismatches limited what could be done. Earhart expected assistance, yet communication plans had weaknesses that became painfully clear only when the moment arrived. You sit with the planning documents and later analysis, and you see how a system can look adequate on paper while still having hidden fragility. Investigation afterward becomes a way of tracing that fragility with calm, exact attention. The same is true of the receiving antenna reportedly damaged or lost during the takeoff from Leh. If Earhart's ability to receive certain transmissions was reduced, the flight's communication situation was compromised from early on. Investigators later considered how much this mattered and what messages may never have reached the cockpit. You can imagine the small physical event of an antenna trailing or breaking, not as spectacle, but as one of those minor material facts that can echo through a vast space. A wire can become part of a fate. Yet even here, restraint matters. A damaged antenna does not solve the case by itself. It helps explain why guidance failed, but it does not tell us where the plane finally went. You place it beside the other facts, letting it take its proper place. This is the discipline that long mysteries ask from us. No single detail should be made to carry the whole structure unless it truly can. In the Earhart case, most details are beams, not roofs, and the patient investigator learns where each one belongs. Navigation errors, if they occurred, also belong in that careful structure. Noonan's dead reckoning from Leh would have depended on winds, speeds, headings and fixes obtained along the way. A small error could grow, a corrected error could shrink. A missed celestial observation could matter. You sit with the mathematics as if with a quiet, weathered instrument, useful but limited. The numbers offer clarity up to a point, and then they give way to the lived uncertainty of an aircraft over water, searching for a low island in light. Light itself is part of the final morning. Sun angle, glare, cloud shadows, and the contrast between water and land could affect whether Howland was visible. A small island may stand out clearly from one direction and vanish from another. Searchers later faced the same problem from their own aircraft, looking down at reefs and islands that could deceive the eye. You imagine the white brightness at the horizon, the fatigue behind the eyes, and the way the mind might keep expecting a shape that did not appear. The phrase, "must be on you," reported from Earhart, carries the softness and strain of the moment. It suggests nearness, but not certainty. It suggests expectation, but not sight. You hold the phrase lightly because its emotional force can outrun its evidentiary precision. A person under pressure may speak from calculation, hope, or both. Investigators had to hear the words as data, while later readers hear the human voice inside them. Both kinds of hearing matter, and neither should cancel the other. That dual hearing is part of why the Earhart case remains so human. We listen for facts and for feeling. We want to know what happened, and we also hear the effort in the last communications. A file can contain both without becoming sentimental. You sit with the typed lines, and behind them you sense a pilot still working, a navigator still thinking, a ship still waiting, and a crew still trying to help. The investigation is not a puzzle game. It is a record of people trying to close a distance. The distance did not close that morning, and so the search began to carry the burden. Aircraft from the Lexington later searched enormous areas north and west of Howland, while the Colorado's planes examined islands to the southeast. The search pattern reflected the evolving judgment of planners, reports, and theories. You look at those patterns with the calm of hindsight, but also with respect for the work. Every line on the map meant fuel, risk, labor, and a crew scanning until their eyes and attention were tired. Search fatigue is rarely mentioned in brief summaries, but it matters. Looking for a small object in a vast area is exhausting. The mind begins to sort shapes automatically. It rejects most of what it sees. It may overnotice or undernotice. The body grows warm in the aircraft. The engine noise becomes constant. The horizon repeats itself. You imagine a searcher blinking against the glare, marking a possible sighting, then circling back only to find wave foam or reef shadow. The ocean teaches patience by denying quick certainty. Reports from the island searchers were similarly shaped by time and viewpoint. A pilot passing over Gardner Island could note signs of recent habitation without knowing whether those signs belonged to castaways, colonists, prior visitors, or something else. Later researchers would study that phrase with great interest, but at the time it did not become a confirmed discovery. You can feel the difficulty there. Evidence does not always announce its importance when first seen. Sometimes it becomes meaningful only after years have rearranged the questions. This happens often in old investigations. A detail considered minor becomes central later. A note made in passing becomes a focal point. A place searched briefly becomes a place revisited many times. The Earhart case is full of such returning details, and you move among them like someone walking through a quiet archive after hours. The building is still, the table lamp is warm, the files are open. Each small note waits to see whether time has given it a new neighbor. A new neighbor might be a tide calculation. It might be a photograph. It might be a record of colonial settlement on Gardner Island. It might be an artifact found decades later in a place where someone once camped. The investigator's work is to see whether these neighbors truly belong together. Coincidence is common in history. So is connection. You cannot assume either one too early. You let the items rest side by side, and you watch for a pattern that remains after the wishful parts have fallen away. Tide studies connected to the post-loss signal theory offer a good example of patient reconstruction. Researchers asked whether the Electra, if on a reef flat, could have transmitted when the tide was low and fallen silent when water reached critical parts of the aircraft. That is not a cinematic question. It is a question of time, height, electrical systems, and reef conditions. You can picture tide tables spread beside signal logs, the pages held open by a paperweight, while someone follows hour after hour with a fingertip and pencil. If the times align, the theory gains interest. If they do not, it loses weight. Even when they align, other questions remain. Was the plane actually there? Could the radio operate? Were the batteries charged enough? Would the antenna function? Could anyone hear the signal under those conditions? The patient investigator does not let one match answer everything. You feel the quiet discipline of adding each question not to ruin hope, but to keep hope from becoming louder than the evidence. Some reported signals included troubling fragments that people interpreted as distress calls. We hold them gently, without repeating them as certainty. Radio in that era could carry stray voices, misunderstandings, hoaxes, interference, and sincere mishearings. Yet it could also carry real messages under odd conditions. You sit with that ambiguity as night settles around the imagined listening posts, where operators and amateurs alike leaned toward receivers. Static has a texture in the mind, dry and restless, and inside it, a human voice can seem both near and impossibly far. The world listening for Earhart became a kind of distributed investigation. Not everyone was trained, not every report was useful, but the listening itself shows how a case can expand beyond official walls. People wanted to help. People wanted to hear. People wanted to be the one who caught the clue that brought the lost aircraft back into the map. You can respect that longing while still keeping the reports in order. Compassion and verification sit beside each other, as they must in any cold case. Verification often meant disappointment. A signal could not be repeated. A bearing crossed no plausible location. A voice might be identified as something else. A supposed clue dissolved under scrutiny. You can feel the emotional labor of that, the way investigators must let promising things go. It is quieter than discovery, but just as important. The file becomes more trustworthy each time an unsupported claim is removed or reduced. In patient work, disappointment can be a form of service. Decades later, that service continued through historians and researchers who revisited the known documents. They compared copies, corrected mistakes, argued about interpretations, and sometimes changed their own minds. You can imagine a researcher at a kitchen table late at night, surrounded by photocopies, with a mug gone cold and a ruler laid across a chart. This is not the grand image of detection. It is better. It is humble, repetitive, and honest. The kind of work that lets a case remain alive without becoming careless. The Earhart case also shows how technology changes the questions people ask. Early searchers asked where a ship or plane could go quickly. Later, oceanographers asked what currents and underwater terrain might do. Radio specialists asked about propagation and antennas. Forensic anthropologists asked what old bone measurements might mean. Aviation historians asked about aircraft construction and repair records. Each discipline brought a different lamp to the table. None illuminated the whole room alone, but together they showed more of the corners. Interdisciplinary work can be slow because experts do not always speak the same language. A radio engineer may think in frequencies and signal strength. A historian may think in provenance and context. A pilot may think in wind, fuel, and visibility. An archaeologist may think in stratigraphy, disturbance, and artifact placement. You sit with all of them, translating gently, learning that a cold case of this size cannot belong to one profession. It becomes a meeting place for many kinds of patient knowledge. That meeting place can be uneasy. The aviation historian may distrust a dramatic witness account. The archaeologist may resist an interpretation that removes an artifact from its site history. The radio analyst may caution that a signal report is weaker than it looks. The public may prefer the version that feels most complete. Investigation moves through these tensions quietly when it is done well. You listen to each caution not as obstruction, but as the sound of the file being protected from overreach. Overreach is one of the constant risks in famous cold cases. A small clue can become famous before it is fully understood. A possible artifact can be photographed, named, and emotionally claimed. A theory can gather followers before the evidence is settled. The Earhart case has seen this pattern more than once. You do not need to scold it. You simply return to the slower pace. Measure again, compare again, ask what else could explain it. Let the evidence remain plain, even when the story around it grows bright. Plain evidence can be beautiful in its own way. A log entry written at the time, a map with a search track, a maintenance note, a weather report, a photograph dated clearly. These items do not promise more than they can give. They sit quietly and offer their small truth. You can feel relief when you find one, because in a case full of uncertainty, even a modest, reliable fact is like a chair pulled close to a table. It gives the mind somewhere to sit. One reliable fact is the timing of Earhart's departure from Leh and the expectation of arrival near Howland after a long flight across the Pacific. Another is the series of radio messages received by a tasker. Another is the absence of a confirmed arrival or wreckage. Around these firm points, the theories move. You can visualize them as small stones on a cloth, with threads running between them. Some threads are strong, some fray. Some seem strong only because many people have touched them. The investigator must learn each thread's feel. The departure from Leh itself has its own atmosphere. The runway, the fuel load, the last checks, the tropical warmth, the knowledge that this leg was difficult and important. You imagine the Electra heavy with fuel, engines turning, propellers stirring dust and grass, people watching as the aircraft lifted away. It is easy to treat that moment as the beginning of a mystery, but for those present, it was part of an ongoing journey. The investigation later makes it a threshold because everything after it depends on that leaving. Leh's records, weather information, and witness observations became part of the background investigators had to consider. How much fuel was aboard? What was the aircraft's condition? What radio arrangements were expected? What course was planned? You sit with these practical questions, and the story returns to work. Flights are made of preparation before they are made of distance. Every list checked on the ground becomes a silent partner in the air. The old investigation understands this, and so you follow it back through each pre-flight detail. The world flight attempt had already involved repairs, delays, and a change in direction after an earlier accident in Hawaii. That history matters because it shows the project as real and complicated, not a smooth line around the globe. Earhart and her team adapted plans, rebuilt schedules, and continued. By the time the Electra reached Leh, the journey had accumulated fatigue, public attention, and practical strain. You feel that accumulation in the background of the final leg, like weight placed carefully in the hold. Still, investigators had to avoid turning fatigue into a complete explanation. It may have mattered, it may not explain enough. The same is true of radio confusion, weather, navigation error, or search limitations. Each factor can be significant without being singular. The Earhart case resists the comfort of one cause. It invites a woven explanation, one made from several strands, where the final outcome may have emerged from a series of small mismatches, rather than one clear failure. This is often true in real investigations. Disasters and disappearances rarely come from one dramatic thing. They come from systems, timing, assumptions, conditions, and human limits meeting in an unforgiving moment. The patient detective learns to look for accumulation. You ask what was slightly off, what was misunderstood, what was delayed, what was unavailable, what was hoped rather than confirmed. The answer may not sit in one line of the file, but in the quiet pressure between many lines. The Earhart case is especially suited to that kind of reading. It has no single final object, no recovered cockpit instrument frozen at one setting, no survivor account, no clean wreckage field. It asks you to infer from absence and fragments. That can be frustrating, but it also slows the mind. You cannot rush where the evidence does not rush. You lean back, breathe, and return to the table. The file will not move faster because you want it to. It asks for patience. Patience also appears in the way searches are funded and organized. A deep ocean expedition is not a thought experiment. It requires vessels, equipment, specialists, weather windows, permissions, and money. An island excavation requires logistics, environmental care, site documentation, and proper handling of finds. You can imagine months of planning leading to days in the field, and then months more of analysis. The public may hear only that nothing definitive was found. The investigators know how much careful labor lives inside that nothing. Nothing definitive can still teach. A searched area may become less likely. A supposed anomaly may be identified as geology. An artifact may be dated to another occupation. A witness account may be contradicted by records. These outcomes are not failures when they refine the map of possibility. You sit with that idea because it is central to cold case work. The file improves by subtraction as well as addition. Each ruled out path leaves the remaining paths a little clearer, even if the final door remains closed. In the Earhart case, however, ruling out is rarely absolute. The ocean is too large, the records too incomplete, and the traces too faint. A search may reduce a possibility without ending it. An artifact may fail to prove a theory without proving the opposite. A disputed analysis may leave room for further work. You learn to think in degrees. More likely, less likely. Unproven, unsupported. Plausible but weak. Strong but incomplete. These are the quiet words of mature investigation, and they sound softer than certainty because they are truer. Those words may not satisfy a half-awake mind wanting an ending, but they are honest companions for the night. You can rest among them. There is no need to force the Earhart case into a shape it has not earned. The records remain on the table. The ocean remains where it was. The island theories remain carefully marked. The radio logs remain central. You breathe with the slow movement of the file, and the investigation becomes less about solving quickly than about staying faithfully beside the question. The question itself has changed slightly over time. At first, it was where are they now? Then it became where did they go? Later, it became what can the evidence still tell us? Now, for many investigators, it is also how do we know what we think we know? That last question is especially calm and useful. It turns the case inward toward method. You are not only searching for Earhart and Noonan, you are examining the way a human mind builds certainty from fragments and how it can remain humble while doing so. Method begins with provenance. Where did this document come from? Who wrote it? When was it copied? Is this the original wording? Has the page been summarized, translated, or edited? You ask these questions like someone checking the hinges on a quiet old box before opening it. A document without provenance can still be interesting, but it must be handled lightly. In the Earhart case, where so much depends on small differences, the history of a page can matter almost as much as the words on the page. Method continues with comparison. A radio log is compared to another log. A weather report is compared to a flight estimate. An artifact is compared to known items from the same era. A witness memory is compared to dates and movements. You can imagine several pages laid out in a semicircle, each one touching the others only through your attention. The work is slow because the file is not a single voice. It is a small chorus, and not every voice keeps the same time. Method also requires knowing when to stop. Not forever, perhaps, but for the moment. An interpretation may reach the edge of available evidence. A search area may be too expensive to continue. A claim may need more documentation before it deserves attention. You close a folder gently and place it back in the box, not because you no longer care, but because care includes knowing when a page has given all it can give today. There is a kind of rest in that discipline. Rest is not the same as surrender. Cold cases often advance after long pauses. A document is found. A technology improves. A private collection becomes available. A better survey is funded. A former assumption is corrected. The Earhart case has lived through many such pauses and returns. You can feel the rhythm of it across decades. Active search, quiet interval, renewed theory, fresh analysis, another quiet interval. The file sleeps in a manner of speaking, but it does not vanish. It waits for the next careful hand. That waiting gives the case its bedtime quality if we let it. Not because the disappearance is light, but because the investigation teaches slowness. Pages turn, maps unfold, static fades. Ocean light softens. The work asks nothing sudden of us. We sit with what is known and let what is unknown remain unforced. You, tonight, are the detective in the small circle of lamplight, not chasing the mystery, but accompanying it through the rooms of evidence it has occupied for decades. The rooms change. First, the radio room on Itasca, close and warm. Then the ship's deck, bright with glare. Then the cockpit, imagined through instruments and reports. Then the search aircraft, vibrating above reefs. Then the government office with its telegrams and maps. Then the archive, cool and dry. Then the island, hot and rough underfoot. Then the research vessel, dark monitors glowing over deep water. Each room offers a different way to listen to the Earhart case, and each asks you to listen gently. Listening gently means allowing the people in the case to remain more than functions. Amelia Earhart was not only a missing pilot, Fred Noonan was not only a missing navigator, the Itasca operators were not only names in a communications failure, search crews were not only lines on a map, later researchers were not only advocates of theories. Each person had fatigue, skill, hope, limits, and a private life beyond the record. Patient investigation leaves room for that, even when the file can only show a portion. You can sense those portions in small details. A notation in a log, a signature at the bottom of a report, a correction typed over an earlier line, a search pilot's observation about surf or vegetation, a later researcher's careful footnote. Though we do not linger on footnotes tonight, these traces are quiet reminders that real people carried the case forward. They did not know they were building a legend. They were trying in their own time and place to help the record become more true. Truth in a case like this is approached, not seized. You may get closer through elimination, through better evidence, through clearer context. But the final truth may remain beyond reach until a decisive object appears. That possibility keeps investigators both hopeful and cautious. Somewhere, perhaps, metal rests under silt or coral. Somewhere, perhaps, a document remains unread in a box. Somewhere, perhaps, an old assumption waits to be corrected. You let these possibilities exist without making them promises. They are simply the quiet weather of the case. The aircraft's construction has offered many technical paths for inquiry. Researchers have studied rivet patterns, patch repairs, material types and photographs of the Electra before the final flight. A piece of aluminum found on Nicomaroro, for example, drew attention because some believed it might match a repair area on the aircraft, while others challenged that interpretation. You sit with such debates carefully. The metal has dimensions. The photographs have grain. The aircraft had a history. The island had a history. The conclusion must be earned by all of them. A fragment can feel intimate because it seems touchable. Unlike a theory, it has edges. It catches light. It can be measured, turned, compared. But touchability can make it emotionally persuasive before it is evidentially secure. You remind yourself of that as you imagine the aluminum on a workbench, cool under gloved fingers, with calipers nearby and photographs spread beside it. The patient investigator asks not, "Does this feel like the Electra?" But what exactly does this object show? And what else could it be? The same care applies to glass and cosmetic items found in island contexts. A jar, a mirror fragment, or a compact may suggest gendered use to modern eyes, but islands and settlements are complicated places. Objects move through trade, reuse, disposal, and accident. You look at each item in its archaeological setting, because without context, even a familiar object can become misleading. The smell of soil, the position in a site, the association with other materials, the disturbance of the ground, all become part of the evidence. Archaeology brings slowness into the investigation in a literal way. Soil is moved carefully, layers are recorded. Finds are bagged and labeled. The ground is not merely searched, but read. On Nikumaroro, this reading must account for later habitation, coconut planting, wartime activity, storms, and animal disturbance. You can feel the sun on the back of the neck, the grit on the hands, and the relief of shade under sparse cover. Every patient motion says that if the island holds anything, it will not be found by forcing. The deep ocean search has its own patience, less tactile but equally demanding. Survey data may take long hours to gather and longer hours to interpret. A sonar return can look promising at first, then become ordinary after another pass. A remotely operated vehicle can descend for hours toward a target that turns out to be rock. You sit in the dim control room, hearing quiet voices and equipment fans, while the screen shows a world without sunlight. Investigation here becomes trust in instruments, procedure, and endurance. Endurance may be the word that most belongs to the Earhart case. The flight itself required endurance. The decades of inquiry required endurance. Even the listener tonight practices a soft version of it, staying with a question without asking it to entertain or alarm. You turn another page. The paper whispers. The ocean on the map remains blue and wide. The case offers no sudden door, only the long hallway of careful thought, and we walk it at a gentle pace. As the hallway continues, we come again to the role of official reports. They can appear dry, but their dryness is useful. They show what was believed at the time, what was done, and sometimes what was missed. You read them for content and for boundaries. What did the report include? What did it not include? What assumptions shaped its language? A report is not the whole event. It is an organized remainder of the event, and in the Earhart case, organized remainders are precious. Precious does not mean perfect. An official report can contain errors, limitations, or institutional bias. A private memoir can preserve details and also reshape them. A newspaper can capture immediacy and distort emphasis. A later analysis can bring expertise and also bring attachment to a favored theory. You keep all these forms in conversation. None is allowed to dominate simply because it sounds authoritative or vivid. The patient detective listens to tone, source, timing, and corroboration, letting the evidence find its proper place. One quiet pleasure in this work is the recovery of proportion. Famous mysteries often swell in public imagination until every detail seems equally dramatic. Investigation makes them different sizes again. Some details are central. Some are peripheral. Some are interesting but weak. Some are touching but not evidentiary. You begin to see the file as a room where certain objects stand near the lamp and others sit in softer shadow. The Earhart case becomes calmer when everything is allowed to return to its correct scale. At the center, still, is the missing approach to Howland. Around it are radio limitations, navigation uncertainty, fuel, weather, search choices, and later inquiries. Farther out are theories built on fragmentary witness accounts or artifacts whose meaning remains disputed. You can move from center to edge and back again, always re-anchoring yourself when the room grows too crowded. The case name itself, Earhart, can become large enough to obscure the mechanics, so you whisper the mechanics back into view. Radio, line, fuel, search, sea. The sea is the hardest witness. It does not keep records in a human way. It moves, covers, corrodes, and reflects light. It can receive an aircraft and leave no visible trace. It can push wreckage far from where anyone expects. It can protect objects in cold darkness or break them beyond recognition. When investigators look toward the sea in the Earhart case, They are looking toward a witness that has had almost a century to remain quiet. The island, by contrast, seems more readable, which may be why it has drawn so much hope. Land feels searchable. Land can hold campsites, bones, bottles, tools, and stories, but land can also confuse. People arrive after the fact, objects accumulate, weather rearranges, the readable page becomes overwritten. You stand in imagination on Nikimaro's coral ground and sense that it is not a blank clue waiting for one story. It is a place with many histories layered under heat, salt, and green. Those layered histories include colonization efforts after the disappearance, wartime activity, and later visits. Each layer could leave materials that resemble or mask earlier traces. A careful investigator must know the island's chronology before assigning meaning to an object. You can imagine a site map marked with units, finds, and dates, alongside historical records of settlement and supply. The work is almost domestic in its patience, sorting what belongs to whom, which activity, which decade, which story. Only then can a possible Earhart connection be weighed with fairness. Fairness is owed to the evidence and to the people. It is also owed to the island itself. A place used as a clue can be flattened by outsiders. Patient investigation resists that. It lets Nikimaroro be more than a possible ending to Earhart's flight. It was and is a real island in the Pacific, with ecological, colonial, and human histories of its own. When you hold that in mind, the search becomes more careful, less possessive, and more attentive to what the place can and cannot say. The same fairness applies to Howland. It is not only the missed destination. It was a prepared landing point, a lonely outpost, a small place made briefly central by aviation ambition. People built and waited there. The Itasca stood offshore. The island's smallness is part of the story, but so is the human effort to make that smallness visible to an approaching aircraft. You can picture the runway markings, the shore, the ocean light, and the hope that infrastructure, however modest, could turn a speck into a harbor. A harbor, in this case, meant fuel and continuation. Earhart's world flight was not supposed to end at Howland. It was a stop, a link in a chain. That is another quiet sadness in the file. The place that became famous through absence was meant to be temporary. Investigators searching the records must remember that the participants were oriented toward what came next, not toward the disappearance we now study. The future they imagined was still moving ahead of them, bright and ordinary, just beyond the landing. When the landing did not happen, the imagined future broke into documents. Telegrams replaced arrival photographs, search orders replaced refueling plans, newspaper speculation replaced progress updates. You can feel that change in the texture of the archive. Before, the papers belonged to movement. After, they belonged to recovery and explanation. The Earhart case turns at that point from journey to investigation, and everyone who touches the file afterward lives on the far side of that turning. Living on that far side means knowing the outcome without knowing the ending. We know Earhart and Noonan did not complete the flight. We do not know exactly where their journey stopped. This partial knowledge gives the case its strange stillness. It is not open in every direction. It is bounded by facts, yet unclosed at the center. You can rest inside that bounded uncertainty tonight, as the lamp makes a small circle on the desk and the Pacific spreads far beyond the edges of the map. The maps themselves differ. Some show the planned route, some show search areas, some show theoretical paths after missing Howland, some focus on Nikimaroro and the Phoenix Islands. Each map is an argument as much as an image. It says, look here. It says, this distance matters. It says, this line might explain the next movement. You unfold them one by one, careful not to tear the creases, and you learn that every map in the Earhart case is also a form of question. A good map can calm the mind. It gives shape to what is otherwise vast. But in this case, every map also reminds you of what is missing. The final track. The line from lay ends before certainty. After that, there are projected lines, possible turns, search grids, and hypotheses. You trace them gently, not to chase the plane, but to understand the thinking of those who did. Their minds moved across these charts under pressure. and later minds have moved across them with more time, but not always more answers. Time changes pressure. In 1937, speed mattered because survival might depend on it. Decades later, accuracy matters more than speed because the people are gone and the task is historical truth. That difference should soften our judgment of early decisions and sharpen our standards for later claims. You can sit with both. The first investigators needed to act. Later, investigators need to be careful. Both forms of work can honor the same lost flight in their different ways. The early searchers operated under weather, fuel, command structures, and public attention. Later searchers operate under funding limits, technological constraints, and the weight of prior debate. Neither group works in an ideal world. That may be the deepest lesson in the Earhart case. Investigation is always done from somewhere, with particular tools, under particular pressures. You, as the quiet reader tonight, can see more of the whole field. But even your view has limits. The file teaches humility by never becoming entirely still. It continues to move whenever a new analysis appears. A radio expert revisits signal strength. An aviation researcher examines fuel endurance. An archaeologist reviews artifact context. An ocean search team releases data. A historian finds a misread date. Each movement may be small, but the case receives it. You imagine the old file as a pond in dim light, each new fact making a soft ring on the surface. Some rings fade quickly, some reach the edge and change the reflection slightly. Slight changes are worth noticing. They may not make a headline, but they improve the work. A corrected misconception can prevent years of drift. A clarified record can reduce noise. A careful negative result can discourage an unlikely search area. The patient detective values these modest gains. You do not need every page to shine. Some pages only clean the glass through which later pages will be read, and in a cold case, that cleaning is a quiet form of progress. The public imagination, however, often prefers shine. Earhart's life, her fame, the ocean, the missing aircraft, and the many theories create a powerful story. It is natural for people to lean toward the version that feels most complete, but investigation is not obliged to satisfy narrative appetite. It is obliged to evidence. You remind yourself of that whenever a theory begins to feel too smooth. Real events have rough edges. The Earhart case, if handled honestly, keeps many of its edges. One edge is the lack of a confirmed wreck site. Another is the uncertainty around post-loss signals. Another is the loss of the Gardner Island bones. Another is the challenge of interpreting artifacts from a layered island. Another is the incomplete nature of radio communication that morning. You hold these edges without trying to sand them down. They keep the case from becoming a bedtime fable. They make it a real investigation, calm but serious, unresolved but not empty. Not empty is important. The Earhart case is sometimes spoken of as if it were pure mystery, but it is full of evidence. It is just not full of final evidence. That distinction makes the work richer. You can spend hours with radio procedures, charts, expedition reports, island histories, and aircraft details. The file has substance. It simply lacks the one piece that would let every other piece settle into place. Until then, the substance remains arranged in careful provisional patterns. A provisional pattern can still guide a search. It can tell a team where to look first, which instruments to bring, which records to examine, which claims to set aside. Investigators live with provisional patterns all the time. They are not failures, they are working structures. In the Earhart case, the challenge has been that several working structures have endured, each with enough support to attract attention and enough weakness to avoid final acceptance. You can feel the quiet tension between them, like papers held under separate weights. The crash near Howland pattern is spare. It stays close to the intended route and the last transmissions. It does not require post-loss survival, island artifacts, or distant capture. Its difficulty lies in finding an aircraft in deep water after many decades. The Nikumaroro pattern is more complex. It tries to connect the line of position, possible post-loss signals, island observations, and later artifact work. Its difficulty lies in proving that any island evidence belongs specifically to Earhart and Noonan. You let both patterns rest without forcing a winner. Other patterns, including Marshall Islands and capture theories, have attracted public interest but face substantial evidentiary challenges. They often require longer chains of assumption and stronger reliance on disputed or late accounts. A patient investigator can still read them, but with careful hands. You ask for documents, timelines, transport plausibility, and corroboration. You ask what contemporary records show. The gentleness of the tone does not reduce the rigor of the questions. Calm work can be very firm when the evidence is thin. The firmness protects the people in the story. Unsupported theories can turn real lives into props. They can burden families, distort histories, and distract from better supported work. Patient investigation is compassionate partly because it refuses to use people that way. Earhart and Noonan deserve more than attractive speculation. The search crews deserve fair treatment. Island witnesses deserve careful listening. Later researchers deserve evaluation by evidence rather than by the appeal of their conclusions. The whole case is steadier when handled with respect. Respect also means accepting uncertainty without treating it as failure. This is difficult in a culture that likes resolution. Yet many honest investigations end with probability rather than proof. The Earhart case may one day change, but tonight, as we continue through the file, it remains a study in unfinished knowledge. You can let that be soothing rather than frustrating. The mind does not need to close every drawer before sleep. Some drawers can remain slightly open, with papers resting quietly inside, waiting for morning. Morning in the case is always that 2nd of July morning near Howland. No matter how many decades pass, the file returns there. The sun rises, the radio room listens, the plane calls, the line of position extends, the sea glitters. And then, rather than an ending, the record gives us a widening. Search lines move outward. Theories begin. The first uncertainty becomes a historical landscape. You sit with that widening and notice how gently it happens on paper, one logged time after another. Logged time is a strange comfort. It orders the unorderly. It says this was heard before that. It says this search began after that report. It says this ship moved at this hour. Even when the event is unresolved, the sequence gives the mind a path. You follow it slowly, stepping from one time to the next. In the Earhart case, chronology is one of the few rails we have, and the investigator's hand rests on it often, especially when theories try to pull the mind too far away. Chronology keeps the post-lost signals in context. It asks whether a reported transmission fits the period when the aircraft could still plausibly have power. It asks whether a location was reachable. It asks whether tide and battery conditions make sense. It asks whether the content of a message aligns with known circumstances or later imagination. You can feel the method working quietly, like a loom drawing threads into order. Not every thread holds. Some break, some tangle, some remain, faint but visible. Visibility is another recurring theme. Howland needed to be visible from the air. Wreckage needed to be visible to searchers. Artifacts needed to remain visible to later teams. Documents needed to remain visible in archives. Again and again, the case turns on whether something could be seen, heard, preserved, or recognized in time. You sit with that chain and feel its tenderness. Human knowledge depends on contact. When contact fails by a little, a mystery can last almost a century. Almost a century is a long time for a question to remain active. The world around the Earhart case has changed beyond recognition. Aviation became routine. Satellites crossed the sky. Digital maps placed islands on screens. DNA transformed cold case work. Deep ocean search technology improved. Yet the old question persisted because the key evidence remained hidden or lost. You imagine a modern researcher holding a tablet beside a paper chart, old and new tools sharing the same table. Both pointed toward the same absence. Absence, again, does not mean nothing happened. It means the final evidence has not entered the room. Somewhere in the historical event, there was a real path from Ley to whatever place the Electra finally reached. That path existed, minute by minute, whether we know it or not. The investigation is an attempt to approach that real path through traces. You can find comfort in that. The truth is not imaginary. It is simply not fully available, and so the work moves toward it with patience. Patience can be seen in the way researchers preserve alternative possibilities without giving them equal strength. You may keep a folder for a weak theory, not because you believe it, but because the record deserves organization. You may label a claim unverified, not discarded entirely. You may note a witness account as interesting but unsupported. The file becomes a place where uncertainty is arranged ethically. Each item is given a name, a status, and a place to rest. That is quiet detective work at its most humane. Humane investigation matters because old mysteries attract certainty from people who were not there. It is tempting to declare that someone should have known, should have turned, should have searched, should have heard. But when you sit with the conditions, the easy sentences grow softer. The Pacific was wide, the equipment was limited, the flight was difficult, the search was urgent, the later records were incomplete, the people involved were capable and fallible. The case becomes less about blame and more about understanding limits. Limits are not excuses, they are facts. A radio has a range and a frequency. A plane has fuel and endurance. A navigator has tools and weather. A search crew has daylight and fatigue. An archive has what survived. A modern team has budget and technology. You place each limit beside each effort, and the Earhart case becomes a study in human endeavor, pressed against the material world. That study is calm but not small. It reaches from a cockpit to an ocean floor, from a logbook to a reef. The reef, if we return to Nikimaro for a moment, carries its own possible timeline. Low tide might expose a landing surface. Higher tide might threaten an aircraft. Surf and storms might break it apart. Some material might wash into deeper water. Some might be carried inland or repurposed. Each step is possible only under conditions that must be examined. You picture the reef edge with water folding over it. Again and again. Not hurried, not dramatic, just persistent, the way nature conducts its own investigation. Nature's investigation leaves different records from ours. Coral grows, metal corrodes, wood decays, sand shifts, birds nest, crabs scatter, storms erase. These processes do not care what question we bring. They alter evidence because alteration is what environments do. A patient searcher must understand them. You cannot simply ask whether an object was once present. You must ask what decades of heat, salt, water, and life would have done to it. The answer may explain why a clue is missing or why it has changed its face. Deep water has its processes as well. Sediment can cover debris. Slopes can carry wreckage down slope. Corrosion can change surfaces. Marine life can obscure shapes. Equipment can miss small targets depending on resolution and terrain. You sit with these possibilities not to make the search hopeless, but to make it honest. The ocean floor is not a clean storage room. It is an active environment, slow and cold, where evidence may remain but not in the form imagination first expects. Expectation is a subtle force in investigation. If you expect to find a whole aircraft, you may overlook a scattered field. If you expect an island camp, you may overread ordinary settlement debris. If you expect a conspiracy, you may treat gaps as concealment. The Earhart case teaches the need to examine expectation itself. You, as the detective tonight, occasionally pause and ask what you were hoping to see in the file. That pause is gentle, almost inward, and it keeps the work clean. Clean work is slow work. It does not hurry from clue to conclusion. It documents the path. It leaves room for review. It allows another investigator to follow the reasoning and disagree. In a famous case, that transparency is essential because claims travel quickly and corrections travel slowly. You can imagine a careful researcher writing notes that may seem tedious, yet those notes protect the evidence from becoming legend too soon. The pen moves line by line, and the room stays quiet. Quiet rooms have carried the Earhart case for generations. Government offices, university archives, museum collections, home studies, shipboard control rooms, island field tents. Each room has its own sounds. Paper turning, fans humming, rain on canvas, keyboards tapping, waves beyond the reef. You move through them slowly, and the investigation becomes less a single event than a long companionship with a question. This is what it was like to investigate the Earhart case. to live beside uncertainty and keep your hands steady. The steadiness matters most when a promising lead appears. A possible sonar target, a newly discussed photograph, a rediscovered document, a re-examined artifact. Public attention rises, and the case briefly brightens. Yet the investigator must keep the same pace. Verify, compare, seek independent confirmation, ask what would disprove it. The excitement of others is understandable, but the file cannot be rushed. It has waited too long to be handled with anything but care. Care can feel almost ceremonial, though it is practical. Gloves for fragile material, labels on sample bags, redundant copies of data, calibration of instruments, chain of custody, clear photographs before moving an object, notes that describe conditions, not just impressions. These practices may sound plain, but they are how a clue becomes usable beyond the moment of discovery. In the Earhart case, where so many earlier traces were lost or contested, proper care is not a formality. It is a kind of promise. The promise is to the future investigator. Someone later may have a better tool, a sharper question, or access to a comparison we do not have tonight. If we preserve the evidence well, that person can continue the work. If we distort it now, their path narrows. This is one of the most contemplative parts of cold case investigation. You are always working not only for yourself, but for someone who may open the box years after you are gone, under another lamp, with another careful breath. The Earhart case has already passed through many such hands. Some official, some private, some scholarly, some adventurous, some deeply cautious, some more speculative. The file has absorbed them all. It has been argued over, loved, simplified, complicated, and returned to its shelves. Through it all, the central question has remained strong enough to call people back. You can feel that call without letting it become restless. It is more like a low tone in the room, steady and distant. Distance was the condition of the original flight, and it remains the condition of the investigation. We are distant from the cockpit in time. We are distant from the searchers in experience. We are distant from the aircraft in space, wherever it rests. But investigation is a way of crossing some distance carefully. A radio log crosses time. A map crosses space. A photograph crosses a vanished moment. A respectful reading crosses the gap between public legend and private human effort. The Earhart case survives through these small crossings. Some crossings fail, and that too belongs here. A message sent but not received, a bearing attempted but not obtained, a search flown but not conclusive, a bone found but later lost, an artifact recovered but disputed. These failures are not interruptions of the story. They are the story. They show how difficult knowledge can be, how easily a path narrows, and how much patience is needed to keep walking after certainty has slipped from view. You turn another page and keep going. The page may bring us back to the Itasca's smoke-making efforts, intended to help Earhart see the ship and island area. Smoke is such a physical kind of signal, visible, drifting, dependent on wind and distance. You can imagine it rising from the cutter, a grey mark against the bright morning, meant to make a small place larger to the eye. Investigation later asks whether it could have been seen, from where, under what conditions. Even smoke becomes evidence, a soft column of intention dissolving into air. Air and water, signal and silence, line and island. These pairs recur throughout the case. They are not dramatic opposites so much as working materials. Earhart's voice moves through air. The search moves over water. The island exists low in sunlight. The investigator moves among all of them, never fully at home in one form of evidence. That movement keeps the mind calm and attentive. When one path grows too speculative, another path brings you back to something you can touch. What you can touch tonight are the imagined files, the old paper, the maps, the photographs, the careful notes. You can feel their edges, you can smell dust and cloth binding, you can hear a drawer slide open on metal runners. You can see a typed word slightly blurred where the ribbon struck unevenly. These sensory anchors do not solve the Earhart case, but they hold you close to the honest work of investigation, where every answer must pass through material traces before it can become known. Known facts, probable inferences, and open questions form the three quiet shelves of the case. On the first shelf, the flight, the lost communications, the failed arrival, and the search. On the second, the likely interpretations drawn from radio, navigation, fuel, and search data. On the third, the unresolved possibilities that still invite inquiry. You do not need to label them aloud as shelves, but you sense their order in the room. It helps the mind rest without pretending the question has been settled, and as the night of investigation deepens, we turn once more toward the people who first kept those shelves from collapsing into confusion. The operators, officers, pilots, clerks, and later researchers who wrote things down carefully enough that we can still sit here, all these years later, and follow the paper trail into the soft grey light of another page. That next page brings us back to the ordinary discipline of writing things down, because without that discipline, the Earhart case would have dissolved into rumor much sooner. A radio operator heard what he heard, and then he made a mark. A search planner chose a line, and someone copied it onto a chart. A pilot returned from an island sweep, and an observation became part of a report. You sit with these plain acts, and they feel almost tender, because each one kept a little piece of the morning from passing entirely into air. Air is where the case began to vanish, but paper is where it remained. The contrast is gentle and exact. A voice in static is fragile, passing through distance and weather, while a line on a log can sit for decades in a folder. Yet the paper is only as good as the moment that made it. You read with that double awareness. The record is precious, and the record is limited. It carries what a person could hear, understand, and write down under pressure. And no more than that. This is why transcription matters so deeply in the Earhart case. A word caught incorrectly can alter the feeling of a message. A time entered slightly wrong can affect a reconstruction. A later copy can introduce a change that looks official simply because it is being typed cleanly. You imagine the investigator comparing versions, one sheet beside another, the room quiet except for the soft sound of paper sliding over paper. There is no glamour in this work. There is only the patient wish to bring the wording closer to its first shape. The first shape is not always recoverable. That is a lesson the case offers again and again. We want the original sound, the exact tone of Earhart's voice, the full context in the radio room, the expressions on the faces of the men listening. Instead, we have entries, summaries, recollections, and later analysis. You accept the gap without filling it too quickly. In a sleepful investigation like this, acceptance is not surrender. It is a calm way of letting evidence remain evidence without dressing it in certainty it does not own. You can imagine an old detective, years after the search, remembering the difference between a fact and a feeling. The fact is written down. The feeling may remain in the body. The heat, the waiting, the uncomfortable chair, the growing sense that the expected arrival had shifted into something else. In the Earhart case, both fact and feeling are present, but only one belongs in the official conclusion. The other belongs in the human understanding, where it can be honored without being made to prove. That separation is one of the quiet arts of investigation. You let compassion stand beside analysis, but you do not let it replace analysis. You can feel for Earhart and Noonan without deciding too quickly where they went. You can feel for the Itasca crew without removing every question about communication plans. You can respect later searches without accepting every interpretation. The case becomes steadier when each feeling is given its own chair in the room, not allowed to sit on the evidence. As you turn the pages, names begin to settle into their working roles. Amelia Earhart, pilot. Fred Noonan, navigator. The Itasca, waiting station. Howland Island, intended point. Lay, departure. Gardner Island, or Nikumaroro, later possibility. The Pacific, enormous witness. These names return like quiet markers along a path. A listener who wakes for a moment can hear them and know where we are. We are still with the Earhart case, still in the patient investigation, still moving slowly through what was heard, searched, recorded, and wondered. Wonder has to be handled carefully. It can open a file, but it cannot close one. Many people first come to the Earhart case through wonder, through the strange feeling of a famous aircraft vanishing near a tiny island. That feeling is understandable. It may even be the doorway into more disciplined work. But once inside the file, wonder must lower its voice. It must let the record speak. It must make room for measurements, dates, doubts, and the unromantic labor of checking again. Checking again is nearly a refrain in this case. Check the fuel, check the radio, check the route, check the search pattern, check the artifact context, check the witness statement. You do not say these words as a list to wake the mind, but you feel their steady motion beneath the narration. They are the footsteps of investigation in a long hallway. Each check may find nothing new, yet every careful pass reduces the chance that the file is being led by wish rather than truth. Truth may be quieter than theory. It often is. A theory announces itself with shape and confidence, while truth may arrive as a small correction to a time, a better reading of a log, or the realization that a beloved clue is weaker than it seemed. You sit with that humility. The Earhart case has attracted sweeping answers, but the most useful work often comes in small increments. A corrected assumption can be as important as a discovery, because it prevents the next investigator from walking the same mistaken mile. Miles matter in this case in a way the mind can feel only slowly. A few miles off course near Howland could mean missing the island entirely. A few dozen miles could change the search area. A few hundred miles could separate one theory from another. On the map, miles are small marks. In the cockpit, they are fuel and time. In the search aircraft, they are more water to scan. In the archive, they become numbers that carry the weight of a lost morning. Morning light near Howland was not the same as the calm lamplight we imagine now. It was bright, hard, and practical. The island lay low, the sea reflected the sun, the Itasca waited with smoke and signals. Earhart's aircraft, if near, would have been moving through air that may have looked deceptively empty. You place yourself gently in both positions at once, ship and plane, listener and caller, each trying to find the other through tools that were not quite sufficient. The case rests in that between. Between is a useful word here. Between land and sea. Between signal and silence. Between official search and private inquiry. Between probability and proof. The Earhart case lives in these spaces, and a patient investigator becomes comfortable there. Not because uncertainty is easy, but because forcing certainty would be less honest. You sit in the between with the old documents, and the room grows calmer. There is nothing to chase. There is only the next detail, and the next careful question after that. One such detail is the way Earhart's messages were reported as strong near the end. Signal strength has been used to argue that the Electra was close to Itasca, though interpreting strength across radio conditions is not simple. You can imagine later analysts studying the equipment, the frequencies, and the operator's descriptions, asking how much confidence that strength should carry. A strong signal feels like closeness to the human mind. The technical mind asks closeness. Under what conditions and with what limits? Limits return again. The Itasca's direction finder could not easily take bearings on the frequency Earhart used in her final transmissions. Earhart's own direction-finding attempts did not produce the guidance she needed. Communication plans depended on coordination that became tangled in practice. You sit with this not as blame, but as system study. A plan can contain untested assumptions. A mission can reveal them only when there is no time left to repair them. The investigation afterward becomes a quiet examination of those exposed assumptions. Assumptions can be invisible until they fail. Everyone may assume a message will be heard, a bearing taken, an island seen, a schedule maintained, a fuel estimate sufficient. When the outcome changes, the assumptions appear like ink underwater. Investigators then try to name them. What did the crew assume about Itasca's transmissions? What did Itasca assume about the aircraft's receiving ability? What did planners assume about navigation accuracy and radio support? Each question is a little window into the practical world of 1937 aviation work. That practical world had courage in it, but not perfection. The long-distance flights of the era depended on improvisation, skill, and machinery under strain. Earhart was experienced, but the world flight pressed aircraft and crew across extraordinary distances. Noonan was skilled, but celestial navigation over ocean still depended on conditions and precise time. The Itasca crew was capable, but radio coordination was complex. You hold all this together and feel the case become more human, less mythic, more deserving of patience. Patience also means resisting the tendency to make hindsight neat. Because we know the flight failed to arrive, every earlier difficulty can seem like an omen. The earlier crash in Hawaii, the equipment issues, the demanding route, the radio misunderstandings. But the people living those moments did not know they were omens. They were problems to be managed, and many problems had already been managed successfully during the journey. You read backward, but you try to think forward, as they did, step by careful step. Thinking forward helps you understand the confidence of continuing. The aircraft had crossed many legs. Earhart and Noonan had solved many practical problems. The world flight was difficult, but difficulty had been part of the plan from the beginning. By Ley, the final Pacific crossing was daunting, yet not imagined as impossible. Investigators later had to reconstruct that confidence without judging it too harshly. Confidence is not arrogance when it rests on preparation and experience. It is simply part of how demanding work gets done. And yet demanding work can still end in uncertainty. That is the quiet truth beneath so many old cases. Competent people, real preparation, and serious effort do not guarantee a clear outcome. The Earhart case is not a lesson in one person's failure as much as a study of how conditions, tools, and distance can overwhelm good intentions. You let that thought rest gently. It makes the investigation more compassionate because it turns the focus away from blame and toward understanding the full setting. The setting includes public fame. Earhart's status shaped how the search was perceived, how newspapers reported it, and how later generations remembered it. Fame can preserve a case because people continue asking questions. Fame can also distort a case because symbols are easier to carry than details. You sit with both effects. Without fame, some records might still exist, but fewer people might revisit them. With fame, the records are often surrounded by legend. The investigator's task is to pass through legend back into detail. Detail is where Amelia becomes a working pilot again. Detail is where Fred becomes a navigator with charts, not a footnote. Detail is where Itasca becomes a ship full of men doing specific jobs, not merely a failed rendezvous point. Detail is where Howland becomes coral, heat, runway, and horizon. When you restore detail, the case becomes quieter and more respectful. It no longer floats as a myth above the Pacific. It returns to the material world, where people touched switches, held pencils, and watched the sky. The sky itself was a tool for Noonan, at least when it allowed itself to be read. Celestial navigation required sightings, calculations, and timing. The rising sun could give a line of position, but not the full certainty of a modern navigation display. You imagine the navigator's work as both mathematical and physical, eyes to the sky, hand to the chart, mind adjusting for motion and drift. Later investigators, reading the final line of position message, had to imagine that work carefully, because a navigational phrase can contain a whole method. Methods can be misunderstood when removed from their working context. A casual reader may think a line of position should have led directly to Howland. A navigator knows it gives one part of an answer. A historian knows the phrase, as recorded, may not reveal every calculation behind it. A pilot knows that while calculations continue, fuel and visibility keep pressing. You let these expert perspectives sit together. The Earhart case becomes calmer when no single reader is allowed to flatten the technical problem into an easy sentence. Easy sentences are tempting in old mysteries. She missed the island. They landed on a reef. The radio failed. The search looked in the wrong place. Each may contain part of a possibility, but none should be used too quickly. A long investigation teaches suspicion of simple completeness. You can still use plain language, but you keep the thought layered. Missing the island may involve navigation, weather, radio, visibility, and fuel. A reef landing may require tides, terrain, aircraft condition, and subsequent search interpretation. The truth, if found, may be woven. Woven truths require patient hands. You pull one strand and see what moves. Radio affects search area. Search area affects likelihood of missed wreckage. Fuel affects reachable islands. Tide affects possible transmissions. Artifact context affects island theory. Every strand has tension. You cannot pull too hard, or the pattern distorts. This is what makes the Earhart case suitable for a long, quiet telling. It does not reward hurry, it asks the mind to move slowly, as if smoothing a cloth over a table before reading the map. Maps of the Phoenix Islands bring a particular stillness. The names sit in blue space, each island separated by distances that look modest on paper and immense in flight. Gardner Island, McKean, Hull, Sydney, Canton, Enderbury. Some were searched from the air, some became part of later discussion. You look at the group and understand why the line south from Howland matters to Nikumaroro supporters. A line drawn through the intended destination can continue toward land, and land has a way of holding the imagination gently. But imagination must pause before reaching shore. Could the Electra have flown that far with remaining fuel? Would Earhart and Noonan have chosen that direction? Could they have seen the island? Could they have landed safely enough to transmit? Would search aircraft have missed them? Each question asks for evidence. The island theory is not one idea, but many connected requirements. You sit with each requirement in turn, the way a careful person checks each knot in a cord. Not pulling roughly, just making sure it holds. The crash near Howland explanation has its own requirements. The plane must have failed to find the island, continued until fuel was exhausted, and entered the ocean somewhere not found by searchers. That may be straightforward, but proof still requires locating debris or establishing a final area with greater confidence. You imagine the ocean around Howland, deepening rapidly, a blue expanse over underwater slopes and plains. Searching there is like reading a book in darkness, with only a narrow beam moving slowly across each page. Neither setting gives up answers easily. That is why the investigation has endured. Land preserves and confuses. Sea conceals and disperses. Archive clarifies and limits. Memory enriches and alters. You keep moving among these four places, and each time one seems ready to solve the case, another asks for caution. It is not a frustrating movement tonight. It is rhythmic, like tide under a pier. The question comes forward, then recedes, leaving another small piece of context on the shore. Context is especially important for the reported bones on Gardner Island. They were found in a place later associated with possible castaway evidence, but the original remains were examined and then lost, leaving only measurements and related notes. Some later researchers argued those measurements could be consistent with Earhart. Others argued the original examiner's view or the limited data did not allow such certainty. You approach this gently because human remains should never become merely a debating point. They represent someone known or unknown and deserve dignity. Dignity means speaking softly and precisely. It means saying what the evidence can bear and what it cannot. Without the bones themselves, modern analysis is constrained. Measurements can be reinterpreted, but they cannot yield everything that physical material might. DNA cannot be taken from paper. Isotopes cannot be measured from a lost record. The absence is real. You let it remain real. The Earhart case contains many absences, but this one feels especially quiet. A person-shaped question left in the archive. The archive trail around those bones also shows how different standards were in earlier decades. What later investigators would preserve carefully may then have seemed less likely to become central. This is not an excuse, but it is context. People in the past did not know which future questions would matter. You sit with that gently, aware that our own present may be failing future investigators in ways we cannot see. The case becomes a lesson in preservation, and preservation becomes an act of humility. Humility extends to the artifacts found in island searches. A jar fragment, a piece of mirror, a broken bottle, a metal panel, a shoe part. Each can invite interpretation. The investigator's first duty is to slow down. Where was it found? In what layer? Near what other material? Could settlers have used it? Could Coast Guard personnel have left it? Is it consistent with the right period? And if so, with how many possible people? The questions are simple, but their answers require long attention. Attention in the field is different from attention at the desk. In the field, heat and discomfort press on the body. Labels must be written clearly despite sweat and dust. Photographs must be taken before shadows shift. Coordinates must be recorded. Finds must be protected from contamination. At the desk, the work becomes comparison, cataloging, and interpretation. You move between those kinds of attention in the Earhart case, feeling how a possible clue must survive many quiet stages before it can speak with strength. Strength in evidence often comes from convergence. One clue alone may be weak. Several independent clues pointing to the same conclusion may become stronger. But convergence can be deceptive if the clues are not truly independent or if they all arise from the same hopeful assumption. You sit with that caution. A post-loss signal, a line on a map, and an island artifact may seem to converge, but each must first be tested on its own terms. Only then can their combined weight be measured. Measuring combined weight is not a mechanical act. It requires judgment. Good investigators can disagree honestly. One may see Nikumaroro as the more promising path. Another may see deep water near Howland as the most probable answer. Another may reserve judgment entirely. The Earhart case has room for these differences because the final proof is absent. You can listen to the disagreement without needing it to become noise. It is, at its best, the sound of careful minds working around a difficult center. The center remains Earhart and Noonan, not the theories. That is worth remembering often. They were two people on a difficult flight, not symbols placed there to satisfy later curiosity. Every investigation should lead back to that human center. You turn the page and imagine their last known morning, without embellishment. A plane, a navigator, a pilot, a small island not found, a ship listening, the ocean below, a message about a line, then silence in the official record. The simplicity of those facts has its own gravity. Gravity can make a case heavy, but tonight we let it be slow instead. We do not need to press. We do not need to solve what the file has not solved. We can sit beside it, as many investigators have done, and learn from the patient methods it requires. The smell of old paper returns. The desk lamp hums faintly. A map lies partly folded near your elbow. Somewhere in the imagined distance, surf moves over coral, and a radio signal fades into static. Static is not emptiness, it is sound without easy meaning. That makes it a fitting presence in the Earhart case. Investigators listened into static for a voice, and later researchers listened into records for meaning. Both acts require filtering, judgment, and restraint. Hear too little, and you miss a clue. Hear too much, and you create one. You can feel that balance in your own quiet listening tonight. The narration moves slowly, and the case answers only in fragments, asking you to remain kind. Kindness toward evidence may sound unusual, but it helps. You do not yank a document into service. You do not force a witness to be more certain than they were. You do not make an artifact belong where it has not proven itself. You let each piece be what it is. In that way, kindness becomes rigor. The Earhart case, handled kindly, becomes less sensational and more exact, because it is freed from the need to perform a conclusion before the evidence is ready. Readiness may come someday from the sea. It may come from an identified aircraft part, a clear debris field, or a recovered object with unmistakable provenance. It may come from an archive, a document not yet known or not yet understood. It may come from a reanalysis that changes how existing evidence is weighted. Or it may not come at all. You hold these possibilities evenly. The point tonight is not to predict the future of the case, but to stay inside the experience of investigating. Investigating over decades means becoming familiar with disappointment without being ruled by it. A search returns without proof. A promising lead weakens. A public claim dissolves. The file remains. You close one folder and open another. The chair creaks softly. Outside, the night continues. There is a quiet maturity in this rhythm because it accepts that caring about an answer does not entitle anyone to receive it quickly. The Earhart case has taught that lesson to many people across many rooms and many years. Years can soften anger. Early frustration over communication failures or search decisions can give way to a broader understanding of systems under strain. Later disputes over theories can settle into documented disagreement. People who once argued strongly may revise their views as evidence changes. You can imagine the case as a long shoreline, where sharp stones become smoother under repeated tide. Not all disagreement vanishes, but some of its edges soften when the file is handled with time. Time also lets us see the searchers as part of history. The Coast Guard, Navy, colonial administrators, local island communities, later researchers, and modern expedition teams all belong to different eras of the same question. Their tools and assumptions differ, their records differ, their blind spots differ. You move among them carefully, not expecting one era to behave like another. The Earhart case becomes a layered human effort, and the investigator learns to read each layer in the light of its own world. The world of 1937 had its own aviation optimism. Long routes were being imagined, tested, and made public. Radio was powerful but imperfect. Navigation was skilled but demanding. Public attention followed record flights with a sense that distance itself was being conquered. Earhart's world flight belonged to that mood. The disappearance did not erase the achievement of the attempt, but it revealed the fragility beneath the confidence. Investigators afterward had to work inside that contrast between aspiration and limit. Limit appears in the phrase low on fuel, or words to that effect, heard in the final communications. It is a practical report, not a dramatic statement. It tells investigators that time was narrowing. It does not tell them exactly how much time remained. Fuel aboard, fuel consumed, power settings, winds, and possible reserves all mattered. You sit with that uncertainty and resist turning a general phrase into a precise clock. The words matter, but they are not a fuel gauge preserved under glass. A preserved fuel gauge would change the case, but we do not have one. Instead, we have estimates. We have aircraft performance information. We have the flight duration from Leh. We have reported messages. We have weather interpretations. These materials can produce reasoned possibilities, but not a final minute. You can feel how the investigation must live with ranges rather than points. A range is less satisfying than a number, but often more honest. The file asks us to think in ranges, and that thinking slows the breath. Breath is a quiet presence in this narration because the case itself encourages a slower pace. You breathe in with the map opening. You breathe out with the page turning. You listen to static without leaning too hard. You walk the reef without hurrying. You scan the sonar image without expectation. This is not because the subject is simple. It is because the subject is old, and because old mysteries can be approached with the calm of people who know that forcing the pace will not change the past. The past remains fixed, but our access to it changes. That is the paradox of historical investigation. The flight happened once, the search happened once, the records have their origins in those fixed events. But every generation reads them differently, with new tools and new cautions. You can imagine the Earhart case as a lantern slide held up to different lamps over time. The image is the same, yet each lamp reveals different scratches, colors, and shadows. Shadows are not always bad. They show depth. In the case file, shadows appear where evidence is incomplete, where motives are misunderstood, where memories have changed, where environments have altered traces. You do not need to flood them with artificial light. You can mark them honestly and work around them. A shadowed area on a map does not make the rest of the map useless. It simply tells the careful reader where to step more slowly. Slowly, we return again to the atasker's role, because it is the fixed listener in the final known exchange. The ship's crew had prepared to support the flight, and the failure of communication has been studied ever since. The ship transmitted signals, attempted to assist, laid smoke, and then joined the search. You can feel how painful that sequence must have been for those aboard. To be ready, to hear, to fail to connect fully, and then to search the empty horizon is a heavy memory. A heavy memory can shape later statements. People remember what they tried, what they heard, what they wish had worked. Investigators reading later recollections must account for that emotional weight. A memory made under pressure may preserve vivid fragments, but lose technical precision. A person may emphasize actions that show effort, because effort matters to conscience. You hold these recollections with compassion and caution, knowing that both are necessary. The Earhart case asks us to understand memory as evidence, but never as a perfect instrument. Perfect instruments were absent throughout. Radios had limits. Compasses had limits. Charts had limits. Human vision had limits. Even later forensic and search technologies have limits. This does not make the investigation hopeless. It makes it real. You can almost hear the quiet click of a ruler laid against a chart. The pencil mark, the pause, the second measurement. The investigator works with imperfect tools carefully enough that their imperfections are not forgotten. That awareness is part of the craft. Craft can be passed down. A young researcher learns to check original sources. A pilot explains visibility and fuel constraints. A radio specialist describes propagation. An archaeologist teaches context. An archivist shows how to handle fragile paper. The Earhart case becomes a place where crafts meet and teach each other. You sit near the table and listen. No one voice solves the case, but each voice makes the work less careless, and that is a meaningful form of progress. Progress may also come from digital preservation. Scanned records, databases, and shared archives allow more people to compare materials that once required travel and permission. Yet digital access brings its own caution. A scan can flatten texture, crop margins, obscure color, or detach a page from its folder context. You can use the digital copy, but you still remember the physical file. The smell of old paper, the order of pages, the handwritten note on the back. These may matter in ways the screen does not show. The screen has become another room in the investigation. A modern researcher may sit at midnight with a high-resolution image of a chart, zooming into a notation made decades earlier. The glow is cool rather than lamplit, but the posture is similar, leaning in, slowing down, comparing, wondering. The Earhart case adapts to each era's tools. It moves from radio headphones to microfilm readers, from photocopies to sonar displays, from card catalogs to digital archives. Yet its central question remains steady. Steadiness is what keeps the script from needing urgency. There is no fresh alarm here, no breaking update, no sudden demand on the listener. The investigation has been unfolding for a long time. It can unfold a little farther tonight. You are safe in the quiet study of evidence, with the old Pacific maps open and the voices of the past softened by distance. We are not chasing Earhart's plane through the night. We are learning what it meant to search for it with care. Care meant searching the skies and seas when survival still seemed possible. Later, care meant preserving records and reconsidering assumptions. Later still, care meant returning to islands, reefs, archives, and deep water with better tools. The form changed, but the intention remained. Find what can be found. Say what can be said. Leave the rest clearly marked. You turn another page and feel how restful that ethical rhythm can be, because it asks for honesty rather than certainty. Honesty includes saying that some popular images of the case are simplified. The disappearance was not a single dramatic vanishing into nowhere. It was a chain of communications, navigation challenges, search decisions, and later interpretations. The mystery is deep, but it is not shapeless. You can trace its contours. You can know where the evidence is stronger and weaker. The Earhart case becomes less frightening when shaped by facts, and more moving when those facts are allowed to stay plain. Plain facts bring us again to the flight plan. Lay to Howland. Long distance over ocean. Radio support expected. Itasca waiting. No successful arrival. Those facts sit like stones in the stream. Around them, water moves in many directions. But the stones remain. You can rest your attention on them when the theories grow elaborate. The investigator's calm comes partly from knowing where the solid places are. Even in an unresolved case, not everything is uncertain. Some things are firm enough to bear the hand. The hand, in our imagined study, moves from the flight plan to the search chart. It follows Itasca's early movements, then the broader Navy effort, then the later areas of inquiry. Each movement reflects a thought about where the Electra might be. Search is thinking made physical. A ship steams a theory. An aircraft flies a probability. A sonar tow maps a hypothesis. An excavation opens a question in the ground. In the Earhart case, every search is a sentence written across water, reef, or soil. Some sentences end without punctuation. A search finds nothing conclusive, and the question continues. This can feel incomplete, but it is a familiar condition in patient detective work. You do not throw away the sentence. You mark what it covered, what it did not cover, and what confidence it allows. A negative result can still have grammar. It can say, not here under these conditions, not visible at this resolution, not supported by this comparison. Such careful negatives make future work more sensible. Sensible work does not always make famous headlines, but it preserves the case from confusion. The Earhart case needs that preservation because its fame invites constant retelling. Each retelling can clarify or cloud. A calm retelling should leave the listener with respect for the difficulty, not hunger for a preferred ending. Tonight, we keep the pace slow and the evidence close. You do not need to remember every island or instrument. You only need to feel the method. Return, compare, wait, and listen. Listening, finally, is the oldest act in the case. Itasca listened. Shore stations listened. Amateur operators listened. Families listened for news. Later, researchers listened to the documents. We listen now, not for a live signal, but for the shape of patient work across time. The sound in the room is soft, paper, breath, a distant imagined sea. The Earhart case remains before us, and the next page waits beneath your hand with another detail ready to be considered slowly. That detail may be the way official language turned uncertainty into operational movement. Orders had to be given even when the facts were incomplete. Ships had to be assigned. Aircraft had to launch. Search areas had to be prioritized. You can imagine the uneasy practicality of it, the need to act without the comfort of knowing. The words in the orders were likely calm because official language often is, but beneath them sat urgency, hope, and the pressure of each passing hour. Hours mattered acutely in the first days. If Earhart and Noonan were afloat, alive on land, or able to transmit, time could change everything. Searchers had to think in daylight, tides, fuel, distance, and human endurance. Later, investigators working from the safety of archives must remember that early uncertainty was not academic. It had a pulse. You place that pulse beside the typed reports, and the case regains its first human scale. Not as a thriller, but as a coordinated effort to help two missing people while help might still matter. That effort included aircraft flying from ships, a demanding operation in itself. Launching, navigating, searching, returning, and recovering planes at sea required skill and concentration. The pilots were not merely observers. They were working in difficult conditions, with their own risks and limits. You can feel the wind over a carrier deck, the oil smell, the shouted instructions softened by distance and memory. Every search line on a chart carries this physical work behind it, and the investigation becomes fuller when you remember the bodies. Bodies tire, eyes tire, judgment tires. Search planning must account for that, though historical review sometimes forgets it. A pilot who has scanned empty water for hours may not see the world with fresh precision. A radio operator, after long listening, may strain meaning from noise. A planner, under public pressure, may choose the most defensible area rather than an imaginative one. These are not excuses. They are conditions. The Earhart case becomes more understandable when human limitations are allowed into the room. The room of later analysis is quieter, but it has its own fatigue. Long debates can harden positions. Researchers may become attached to a path they have followed for years. Critics may become attached to criticism. The file itself can seem to ask the same questions until the mind blurs. You, tonight, do not need to join the argument. You simply observe how patient investigation must include patience with other investigators, even when their conclusions differ, because difficult cases can make sincere people choose different routes. Routes, again, bring us to the map from Ley. The planned course stretched across open ocean toward Howland, with navigational checkpoints that were largely conceptual once land fell away. Over water, there are no roads, no mountain ranges, no towns passing below. The aircraft carried its own moving frame of reference, built from compass headings, speed estimates, drift, celestial fixes, and time. You sit with that and understand how navigation over ocean is both science and trust, a disciplined conversation with the unknown. Trust can be shaken by weather. If winds differed from expectation, the ground track shifted. If clouds blocked observations, uncertainty grew. If radio signals failed to provide bearings, the crew had fewer external corrections. Each element could be manageable alone, yet together they could widen the circle of uncertainty around the aircraft's estimated position. Investigators later tried to reconstruct that widening circle. You can see it on the chart, not as a dramatic spiral, but as a soft expansion of possible places. Possible places are not all equal. Some sit near the evidence, some require more assumptions. Some are reachable only if fuel estimates are generous. Some depend on witnesses or signals that remain disputed. The investigator's task is to weight them calmly. You do not need to erase the less likely places from the map. You shade them differently. You let probability become a gradient rather than a wall. The Earhart case, seen this way, becomes a landscape of likelihoods fading into blue. Blue dominates every map of the case. Even the island theories are surrounded by it. The blue reminds you that the Pacific was not passive space between clues. It was the main condition. Its size shaped the disappearance, the search, the later uncertainty, and the emotional force of the story. You look at the blue long enough and feel why the case never became easy. A small plane, a tiny island, and a vast ocean form a scale that resists the mind's ordinary sense of closure. Closure, if it ever comes, will likely arrive through something physical. A piece of the Electra tied unmistakably to the aircraft, a debris field documented with sufficient clarity, human remains identified with reliable methods. Until then, closure remains partial. This does not make the investigation meaningless. Quite the opposite. The absence of closure is why the methods matter so much. You cannot rely on the final object, so you care for every lesser object, every document, every measurement, every cautious inference. Inference is the quiet bridge between evidence and explanation. It must be strong enough to walk on, but not mistaken for land. Earhart's final line of position message supports certain inferences about navigation. Signal strength supports possible inferences about distance, though with caution. Fuel reports support inferences about remaining flight time. Search results support inferences about what was likely not seen. You move across these bridges one at a time, feeling whether they flex under your step. Some bridges flex too much. A late witness account unsupported by records may not hold much weight. A photograph interpreted beyond its resolution may not hold. An artifact without secure context may not hold. The patient investigator steps back without anger. There is no shame in a bridge failing if it is tested honestly. The shame would be pretending it held because the view from the other side was appealing. The Earhart case rewards the humility to retreat when the evidence asks softly. Retreat can be a graceful part of investigation. A researcher revises a paper. A search team updates a model. A narrator corrects an earlier simplification. A theory loses ground. These are signs of health when done honestly. The case becomes less cluttered each time someone releases an unsupported claim. You can imagine old notes being reorganized, labels changed, folders moved from likely to doubtful. Nothing loud happens. The room simply becomes a little clearer and the air a little easier to breathe. Breathing easy around an unresolved case may seem strange, but it is possible. The key is not to demand finality from every sitting. Tonight, you open the file, spend time with one portion, and then allow it to remain open. That is how many real investigators work. A case too large for one day must be approached in sessions. The Earhart case has been approached in sessions for decades. By ships, by scholars, by families, by field teams, and now by us in this quiet hour. The hour in the file returns to dawn and morning, but the hour in our room is late. That contrast gives the narration its softness. We read about bright Pacific light from within a pool of lamplight. We read about radio static while our own surroundings are still. We read about search aircraft while our own breath slows. The case does not need to startle us. It only asks to be held with enough attention that the people in it are not reduced to a legend. Legend can flatten even admiration. Earhart becomes the brave aviator. Noonan becomes the navigator. The Pacific becomes mystery, and the details disappear. Investigation reverses that flattening. It asks what radio frequency, what chart, what time, what searchline, what island, what artifact, what document. The more specific the case becomes, the more human it becomes. You can feel that tonight. Specificity is not cold. It is a form of respect because it lets people return from symbol into life. Life before the final flight included ambition, planning, friendship, fatigue, publicity, and ordinary maintenance. Earhart's world flight was not only a bold gesture, it was logistics, fuel drums, mechanics, weather, permissions, delays, repairs, and schedules. Noonan's work was not only celestial skill, it was preparation, calculation, and practical judgment. When investigators look at the final leg, they also inherit all that ordinary groundwork. The case begins long before the last transmission in the accumulated labor that made the flight possible. Possibility is a gentle but complicated word. The flight was possible enough to attempt, the search was possible enough to conduct. Several explanations are possible enough to examine, but possibility alone does not settle a case. You sit with that word and let it keep its modest shape. Many things are possible in the Earhart case, fewer are probable, fewer still are proven. The patient investigator does not confuse those categories because confusion there can make a mystery feel clearer while actually making it more clouded. Clouded thinking can arise from emotion, but also from too much detail without order. The Earhart case contains enough detail to overwhelm. Radio logs, ship movements, weather, fuel, navigation, island histories, artifact reports, bone measurements, witness accounts, and underwater surveys all compete for attention. You need a slow rhythm to move through them. First anchor in the final communications, then examine search actions, then consider later evidence, then return to the anchor. The movement is circular, but not lost. Circular investigation can be productive when each return brings more understanding. The first time you read the last message, it may feel simply poignant. After studying navigation, it feels technical. After studying search patterns, it feels operational. After studying later island theories, it feels directional. After studying radio limitations, it feels communicative and broken. The words do not change, but your hearing changes. This is one of the quiet rewards of patient work. The same page becomes deeper without becoming louder. Loudness would not help here. The Earhart case has had plenty of public noise. What helps is listening at a lower volume. You notice modest uncertainties, small corrections, and the humility in a well-qualified sentence. You appreciate a researcher who says, "This may indicate," rather than "this proves." You appreciate a search report that describes conditions plainly. You appreciate a historian who lets a contradiction remain visible. These are the voices that make an old case safe to sit with at night. Night listening changes the mind's relationship to evidence. You are not trying to win an argument. You are letting the old work pass through your attention. The chart lies open. The ocean on it is quiet. The names Howland, Ley, Itasca, Nikumaro, Earhart, and Noonan recur like low notes. Each name brings you back if your thoughts drift. The script does not need a sharp turn. It moves as the investigation moved, from one careful point to another, always aware of what remains unseen. Unseen does not mean unfelt. The missing aircraft is unseen, yet it shapes every page. The final position is unseen, yet it determines every theory. The inside of the cockpit after the last transmission is unseen, yet investigators continually circle it through inference. You can feel the presence of these unseen things as negative space, like the pale outline left when a picture is removed from a wall. The room remembers what is absent, and the Earhart case is full of that kind of outline. Outlines can guide a search. If you know where something is not, you begin to shape where it might be. If you know what a theory cannot explain, you understand its limits. If you know which evidence is secure, you can build from it without fear. The investigation becomes an exercise in forming an outline from absences and anchors. You draw lightly. A heavy line would pretend too much. A light line can be adjusted when the next document, survey, or measurement arrives with its quiet news. News, in this old case, often comes slowly and with qualifications. A possible new search area, a reinterpretation of old material, a technology that might improve underwater mapping, a renewed debate over an artifact. The public may receive these as developments, but the investigator receives them as additions to be tested. You can imagine placing a new page into the folder, not on top as a final answer, but in its chronological place, where it can be compared with everything that came before. Before is always present, The early records have a gravity no later theory can escape. If a new idea contradicts them, it must explain why. If it depends on them, it must read them accurately. If it extends them, it must show its path. The Earhart case allows creativity only when creativity remains tethered to the record. You sit with that tether as something reassuring, like a bookmark ribbon lying across an old volume. It keeps the mind from drifting too far into the dark water. Water, dark or bright, appears in every possible ending. Near Howland, it may be deep water. At Nikumaro, it may be reef surf and lagoon edge. Along any alternate route, it remains the surrounding fact. The sea is not malevolent in this telling. It is vast, indifferent, and patient. It does not hurry to give back what it receives. Investigators know this, and so they approach it with instruments, grids, and humility, asking for a trace rather than demanding an answer. An answer from the sea would likely be technical before it became emotional. A sonar contact, a visual confirmation, a material sample, a match to aircraft construction, then reports, peer review, documentation, and careful announcement. Only afterward would the wider emotional meaning settle. You can imagine that sequence because good investigation protects the moment of discovery from becoming too sudden. Even if a decisive clue appeared, it would need to be held steady, verified, and placed properly into the record. The record is the true home of any future discovery. Not rumor, not headline, not wish. A found object must enter the record through method. Where was it found? How was it imaged? Who handled it? What tests were done? What alternatives were considered? The Earhart case has waited long enough that any final evidence would deserve that slow welcome. You sit with the thought quietly, not as a climax, but as another example of how patience remains necessary even at the edge of resolution. Resolution, though, is not where we are tonight. We are still inside the investigation, moving from page to page. The next page might concern the people who maintained Howland Island before the flight, the workers who helped make the refueling stop possible. Their labor often sits at the edge of the famous story, yet without it, the rendezvous point would have been only a dot. You imagine the heat, the sparse shade, the work of preparing a place for an aircraft that would never arrive. Their effort, too, belongs to the case. Belonging matters in an old file. It is easy to include only the famous names and central theories. Patient investigation widens the frame just enough to include support crews, radio operators, ship personnel, local witnesses, clerks, archivists, and later technicians. Each contributed to what could be known. The Earhart case was never held by one person alone. It passed through many hands, and those hands left marks, some visible, some invisible, all part of the long chain of care. Care sometimes means simply not throwing something away. A logbook kept, a chart preserved, a letter saved, a photograph labeled. These small acts become gifts to people who were not yet born when the paper was placed in a drawer. You can feel gratitude for that preservation without overstating it. The files are imperfect, but they exist. They let us sit tonight with more than legend. They let us hear the old radio room, see the old search chart, and feel the weight of the folder. The folder grows heavier as later editions accumulate. Expedition notes, scholarly articles, technical reports, interviews, photographic analyses, critiques. Each generation adds paper, and the box becomes more crowded. You lift it carefully from the shelf, feeling its weight in both hands, and understand that a famous cold case can become physically heavy with attention. Yet heaviness is not the same as closure. The box can be full and still unanswered. That is another quiet truth the Earhart case teaches with patience. Patience is also required from anyone listening. The mind may want the plane to appear, the island to speak, the ocean floor to reveal a shape. Instead, the narration gives you what investigators often had: another detail, another caution, another possible path. You can let that be enough for now. The slow pace is not delay for its own sake. It reflects the actual texture of the work, where real certainty comes, if at all, after many evenings of patient looking. Looking is never neutral. What we expect affects what we notice. A researcher who believes strongly in Nikumaro may notice island clues first. A researcher who favors Howland may weigh radio strength more heavily. A critic may notice weaknesses before possibilities. The best investigators know their leanings and account for them. You can do the same tonight. Notice where your attention wants to go. Then return to the file and let the evidence, not preference, decide how long you stay there. There is a calm freedom in that discipline. You do not have to choose a theory to honor the case. You can learn what each theory explains, what it struggles with, and what evidence would strengthen or weaken it. The Earhart case becomes a room with several tables, not a contest demanding immediate allegiance. You move from one table to another, quietly, carrying a notebook. The lamp follows you only so far. Some corners remain dim, and that dimness is part of the truth. Truth with dim corners may be the most honest kind available here. The final known messages are lit. The failed arrival is lit. The official search is partly lit. Later island evidence is unevenly lit. Deep ocean possibilities are mostly dark. Witness theories vary from faint to heavily shadowed. You do not force equal brightness across the room. You let the lighting tell you something. The Earhart case, like many old investigations, is best understood not as a blank darkness, but as a room of uneven light. Uneven light can be restful if we stop fighting it. The lamp shows enough to continue. The darkness reminds us to be humble. You turn another page, and perhaps this one is a chart with a penciled line, or a typed report from a search aircraft, or a later note questioning an earlier interpretation. It does not need to announce itself. It only needs to be read carefully. The old case has no hurry left in it, and so our attention can become unhurried too. Unhurried attention often notices what hurried attention misses. The wording on the line becomes more than a phrase. The word mere becomes less precise than it first seemed. A search description reveals altitude or weather. An artifact report reveals disturbance. A witness account reveals when it was first recorded, not just what it claims. These small noticing acts are the true motion of the investigation. Now they move no ship across water, but they move understanding through the file. Understanding through the file is different from solving. It is still worthwhile. To understand why the case remained unresolved is to respect its difficulty. To understand the limits of the search is to avoid easy judgment. To understand the tools of the era is to see the disappearance in its proper technical world. To understand later debates is to see how evidence behaves over time. The Earhart case gives us all these forms of understanding, even while holding back the final place. Place is the word every theory tries to answer. Where did the Electra end? Near Howland, under deep water. On or near Nikumaroro, after following the line. Somewhere else along a mistaken route. Each answer has a geography. Each geography has an evidence problem. You look at the places softly, one by one, and imagine how different the investigation feels in each. Deep water is cold and remote. Reef is bright and harsh. Archive is dry and quiet. Memory is warm and uncertain. The place changes the method. Method changes the investigator. A person who spends years with the Earhart case may become more cautious in speech, more comfortable with probabilities, more attentive to the weakness of memory, and more respectful of old records. The case trains its readers. It teaches them to wait. It teaches them to separate charm from proof. It teaches them that an unanswered question can still be handled well. You sit under that teaching tonight, and the file feels less like a puzzle than a long apprenticeship in care. Care carries us into the next portion of the investigation, where the later searchers began to revisit not only where the plane might be, but how earlier searchers had thought, what they had missed, and what the old maps still might be willing to show.